Good morning, or rather good morning to those of you in the US, but good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe and in Africa, and good night to those of you, or shortly good night, to those of you in Asia and Australasia. Over 800 people have signed up for this event today, and I want to welcome all of you who are watching and listening now. It's an honor to have you with us. I'm David Friedberg, Director of the Italian Academy at Columbia University and co-director with Barbara Faedda of the International Observatory for Cultural Heritage here. Just in the last few years, we've had controversial events regarding the destruction of monuments in Iraq and the territory of ancient Mesopotamia, about the meaning and implications of the Universal Museum, with Jim Cuno of the Getty, chief amongst those making the Enlightenment case for this cause, about Trump's shocking and land grab of territory containing the sacred sites of indigenous peoples of the US, on the significance of the Savoie report for the African collections of the old Musée de l'Homme and the Quai Branly, amongst many others. And of course, at those events, we always had the protagonists present of the discussion. Today, we're privileged to have with us a group of scholars, curators, and activists to discuss one of the most critical of all the restitution issues of our time, that of what seems to me the open and shut case for the restitution of the Benin Bronzes, let us call them bronzes for the moment, to their original contexts. Of course, I know that the matter is nothing like as simple as this, but that, in the end, is the whole point of today's conference, to unravel these complicated and sort out and reconcile the various sides of the competing issues at stake. I remember how when I first came to London in 1969, the objects that moved me most amongst the icons of the British Museum were not the Parthenon marbles, but the Benin Bronzes. I went back to the museum many times only to see them. My first acquaintanceship with them made me interrogate the very bases of what we think of as masterpieces of art, or what the curators of the British Museum thought of as masterpieces of art. And the first question that came to mind then, of course, was what are these objects, these beautiful but deracinated objects, doing here? My entire career, though some will carp, has consisted of trying to sort out that question. And that is the question that I think we will be asking today. What are the bronzes doing in the places they stand now? And why are they so wrenched from their original context? And what is their future? We at Columbia's Italian Academy and our co-sponsor, the Institute for African Studies, and at the International Observatory for Cultural Heritage, could not be more honored by your presence here today, dear speakers and moderators. So I'm just going to run very quickly through their names. So perhaps the moderators will not have to repeat them again or keep it short. But I want to run through their names partly because my dear colleagues who put up the publicity at the Italian Academy left out some important little parts of their small but important parts of their positions. So first of all, today you'll be hearing from Barbara Blankensteiner, who is from the Museum am Rotenbaum, Kunst und Kultur in der Welt, Art and Cultures of the World in Hamburg, and co-chair, this is very important, of the Benin Dialogue Group, which is playing so critical a role in this entire issue. Then we're very grateful to have here Christine Mullen-Kramer of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art on the Mall in Washington, D.C. So we're greatly honored to have you here also today, and we appreciate your presence very much. Same goes for Philippe Hernandez, who is the person from the Legacy, who is running the Legacy Restoration Trust in Lagos, and will be thinking about the possibilities for the future of these monuments when they come back to their homes. And then, of course, we have with us this morning Dan Hicks, who is from Oxford, where he's Professor of Contemporary Archaeology and Curator of World Archaeology at the Pitt Rivers. And in a way, he was one of the inspirers of this entire project because of his fiery book, The British Museum, which treats for the whole history of the Benin Bronzes, and which I recommend to all of you. The discussion will be moderated in the first session by Chika Okeke Agulu from Princeton, who himself has played a role in the discussion of all such questions of restitution. This afternoon, we have Felicity Podenstein from the Digital Benin project, who is tracing all these locations, all dispersed so widely over the world. She's a lecturer in heritage studies and museum history at the Sorbonne. Then we also will have with us Kokunre Agobontoen Egafona, who is professor of anthropology and sociology at the University of Benin itself in Benin City. So we're very glad to have Kokunre here with us today. And then last, but definitely, well, second last or third last, but not least by any means of the speakers, though, is Abba Issa Tijani, Director General and Chief Executive of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria. So we are really proud to have you with us. I'm also very happy that the second discussion will be moderated by my dear colleague, the Professor of Philosophy and French at Columbia, who's also director of our Institute for African Studies, with whom we have worked long on such issues. I also want to thank a much smaller group of scholars and curators who wanted to participate, but were unable to do so because of the internal institutional pressures. And we were in negotiation with several for some time, and in the end, the matter seemed to them to be too delicate, for reasons you can imagine, to be able to talk about so sensitive a topic today. This, of course, makes us all the more grateful to them and to especially to those of you who were able to contribute and be with us here today. Thank you, dear colleagues. I also want to thank, as I've said, Bashir Dianya, who has supported us from the beginning through all the complex negotiations. His advice has been more precious than I can say. My colleague, Zoe Struther, in the Department of Art History, a historian of African art, whose expertise lies largely with Congolese objects, and has equally encouraged and supported us. And then, of course, I must thank my wonderful, patient, and super competent staff at the Academy, Barbara Faeda, Alison Jeffrey, Abigail Asher, Baron Preston, Adele Parsons, and Kathleen Kanina, and all the many others whom I plagued over the last months about the rights of the Benin monuments. Before the fons et origo of this project, Pierre Lançon takes on the responsibilities for the rest of this conference. I want to introduce him. He's a great sociologist, himself a student of the rights of looted and pirated Latin American works of art. That's where his interest began. But of course, when he was fired up by reading Dan's books, and so we decided at his suggestion to hold this event today. But in the meantime, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you and ask my dear colleague Bashir to take over the welcoming words. Thank you so much. Enjoy the day. Think hard. And Bashir, it's over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I'll keep these words very short because what I want to say is basically welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure, as always, to be associated with the wonderful work that the Italian Academy is doing. This is a very timely conference. By the time it was decided by the Italian Academy, there was not this huge event right now of the decision made by the German government to restitute Benin Bronzes. I'm following the lead of David here, speaking about bronzes, and you are the specialist, so you will absolutely know how I should call them. So just a reminder that this is a year later and a pandemic later, another meeting in this wonderful space that the Italian Academy is. Although, unfortunately, we are visiting this space only virtually, and just like David, I hope that we will all be able to visit in person soon. We organized in October 2019 a conference about restitution of African art. That one was focused on the report written by Professor Sarr and Savoie for the French President Macron, and but this was really something very specific. And now, as David just said, we are dealing with these collections, these objects that are really emblematic in a way of what it means for the African continent to have produced the wonderful arts that has been plundered and taken away from it. So this is a very important conference. And the Institute of African Studies that I am representing here is very happy to be associated with this wonderful initiative, this wonderful conference. And on behalf of this institute, of my colleague, Dr. Jeannie Price, who was also associated with the preparation of this conference, it is my pleasure and my honor to welcome you and to say, let's have a wonderful conference on the most important topic probably in this period on concerning African art and African culture.
Hello, welcome all to this conference that, believe it or not, has been in the works for several months now, yet I believe could not feel more timely. 1 year and a half ago, I was among several hundred people who attended the conference titled The Restitution Debate, African Art in a Global Society, here in New York at the Italian Academy, co-sponsored by the Institute for African Studies. At that time, the report commissioned by the French President Macron from scholars Beneath Savoy and Fellow in SAR had recently been published, and many participants in the conference were wondering what its concrete consequences would be, and whether Savoy and SAR had convinced the museum establishment in Europe and in North America, as well as politicians in former colonial powers, that a new approach to the conservation and ownership of cultural objects from Africa was necessary. So much has happened since October 2019, and I'm not referring here to the global pandemic, although I do want to see a silver lining in the fact that this pandemic that has pushed us to organize this new kind of virtual gatherings that we are attending today, with the great advantage that we can convene guests and attendees from virtually every corner of the planet. But no, the changes I have in mind do concern the world of museums and heritage. In Europe, the debates following the publication of Savoy and SAR's report have indeed started to have concrete consequences. Just to give a few examples that many of you probably have in mind, in France, for once, the parliament has approved the return of some 20-something objects to Benin, Senegal, and Madagascar, a far cry from a revolution that would concern the thousands of objects in French public collections, but this is a beginning nonetheless. In the Netherlands, the government recently announced that it would start implementing a new policy of restitutions towards the country's former colonies, and of course, coming to the case that concerns us today, the federal, the head of the cultural bureau of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs declared less than 2 weeks ago that the country would begin the process of returning the Benin Bronzes held in its museums to Nigeria, alongside strengthened cooperation in the creation of a new museum in Benin City and further archaeological work. Immediately following that declaration, several museums, such as the Museum of the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, announced that they had engaged in a process to return the bronzes they have held in collections for a few decades. Meanwhile, in the United States, another phenomenon has pushed museums to think their mission, or to rethink their mission and relationship to their audience. Following the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, museums have engaged in deep processes of reckoning about how, more often than not, they have been institutions contributing to the reproduction of white supremacy rather than its questioning and demise. So in more ways than we could have predicted, the conference today feels timely and urgent. Over the next few hours, we will hear from some of the most distinguished experts on the Benin Bronzes, or the Benin objects. Why did we choose, as a follow-up to the October 2019 conference, to focus specifically on these objects? We thought as we were preparing today's event that the objects looted from Benin City in 1897 would provide an opportunity to speak about many of the questions that arise when speaking about returns and restitutions. For example, the colonial and violent history of their removal from their place of origin, and the role of museums, of Western museums, in transforming them from the objects of worship into iconic works of art. But the Bronzes also invite us to explore other facets of the debate, such as how are restitutions negotiated? What kind of cooperation can be established beyond the moment of the return of the objects? For how long have countries of origin, such as Nigeria, been asking for these objects back? Upon their return, where should these objects go? And perhaps more provocatively, we will also wonder, for whom should these objects be returned? Beyond the artistic and academic circles that are probably overwhelmingly represented among today's audience, who in Nigeria awaits this return? So these are some of the questions which I hope we'll be able to tackle during the two panels that will form this conference. Because I'm not myself a specialist of Nigeria or of Western Africa, I would like to invite you as we proceed to consider how the particularities of the case of the Benin Bronzes offer lessons for the countless other disputes that are pending worldwide over the fate of other objects. I very much believe that each case has its own specificities, and that for this reason, a massive movement of objects away from Western museums is unlikely. However, let's keep in mind that in other African countries, in Asia, in Latin America, other countries, other communities, other individuals are fighting to also obtain the return of objects they consider a part of their cultural heritage. So let's keep them in mind as we explore further the intricacies of the return of the Benin objects to Nigeria today. Thank you very much for joining us, and I wish you a very good and interesting conference.
Thank you, everyone who is listening or watching this very important occasion, this August event. It's such a pleasure to be part of this program today, because it is one of the most important subjects and questions in the world of culture today. Benin has been in the air for quite a while now, and the conference and the symposium today, in which we're asking further questions about the fate of the diverse objects that are generally referred to as Benin Bronzes that were expropriated from Benin in 1897 by the British Navy and its agents. Today we have on this panel some of the most distinguished voices and agents that have played and will continue to play fundamental roles in determining the discourses, the debates, the practical questions around the fate of the objects that were taken from the Benin Palace in 1897. Yes, Professor Freeberg had introduced the panel, but let me just say a word or two for each of our panelists, why I personally was very much interested in this panel to serve as the moderator. Professor Dan Hicks has written a book that, with all the adulations and critical receptions that it has received, it's important to highlight the fact that he is speaking from within the museum. And this is something that we have not had in the decades of debates around the fate of Benin. Speaking from the museum arguing why the objects must be returned. What we've had over the decades is why they cannot be returned. This is why I think that Dan's book and his work towards the subject, it's really utterly fundamental. And of course, we have Barbara Blankensteiner, who I've known for more than a decade now, for her own work, formerly in Vienna at the Welt Museum, where she organized what I still believe was the most important, the most comprehensive exhibition of Benin art anyone has put together. And with that project, she laid the grounds for revitalizing the debates and the conversations about the Benin objects that are in Western collections. And she's played a further role in initiating the Benin Dialogue Group and the work that it's doing presently in establishing the museum in Benin, of which we will hear about in this panel. And then, of course, we have Christine Mullen-Creamer, who is the Deputy Director at the Smithsonian National Museum for African Art, who herself is one of the really influential scholars in African art, working in the United States and chaperoning the work of the leading Museum of African Art in the United States. I'm really grateful to her for being on this panel, precisely because we do know that a lot of leading figures in the museums, especially in the United States, are very uncomfortable in talking and engaging directly in debates and conversations about the fate of Benin objects, but also largely African art in Western collections. And then, of course, we have Philippe Hernandez, who is such a powerful voice and actor in the present discussion and process of what happens to the Benin objects if, and especially when they are returned to Nigeria. Philip is leading, as we've been informed, the Legacy Restoration Trusts based in Lagos that are basically acting as a focal point for the Nigerian end of these processes and these debates. And so it's very important that we know what the Nigerians are doing from their own end in pushing along these conversations, these debates, and these processes. And so having these four distinguished panelists this morning, listen, the American East Coast, is such an important occasion for me. And I very much welcome all the four panelists to speak to us. And at the end, we would go into the Q&A to discuss further some of the issues that will come up from their presentations this morning. So thank you all for being on this panel, and I look forward to your presentations.
The Benin Dialogue, which includes representatives of the Royal Court in Benin City, the National Commission for Museums and Monuments Nigeria, the Edo government, as well as all European museums with prominent Benin collections, and in the meanwhile also the Legacy Restoration Trust, is an informal group that got together with the common goal to enable the return of the royal art treasures to Benin City. The conversation started with an open-ended outcome based on an understanding that to deal with this difficult legacy is a common concern and a shared responsibility. The trust building and reconciliation process has taken many years and has established a joint community of all institutions involved that operate in partnership and mutual support. Despite the often criticized long duration of the process, much has been achieved away from the public eye and concrete results have been an outcome. The Benin Dialogue was a proactive process generated on the museum level in partnership between European and Nigerian partners 11 years ago. And the first meeting happened in 2010 at the Weltmuseum in Vienna in Austria. It actually somehow was an outcome of the international exhibition project Benin Kings and Rituals, Court Arts of Nigeria, in which the Weltmuseum collaborated also with the Royal Court in Nigeria and the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. And after this large exhibition project that had not been shown in Nigeria, we felt that there is an urgent need to do something about this difficult heritage. The process was a complex, multilateral and transnational collaboration endeavor regarding contested heritage that overcame several challenges in the process. Relation building, in which a multiplicity of European museums had been involved, cannot happen without frictions or disruptions that are needed to constructively feed into future proceedings. All involved have seriously invested and devoted time to bring the process forward. The first step was to give access to collections and transparency, sharing information. Overall, it was an important process to create trust and a community that, in our view, is more conducive to sustainable outcomes than adversary positionings. Therefore, we also opted for confidential internal meetings so that we could open-mindedly have sincere discussions. Since we started so long ago, a lot has happened within the museums and their environment. A new generation of museum directors and curators are in charge in the meanwhile, for whom it is a priority to solve this matter, to have objects circulate and to lobby for restitution of the looted works. And this new generation does not want to shelve the subject like it happened in the 1970s. I do not need to repeat here, I think, what happened in the political environment in the meanwhile, as it certainly is mentioned in several other statements given. The Macron Declaration in 2017, for instance, the coalition contract and several political announcements in Germany, including the publication of a comprehensive guideline on treating cultural heritage of the German Association of Museums, etc., or the political decision in the Netherlands about restitution of colonial heritage. I would like to underscore that when we started the Benin Dialogue, it was happening on a museum level, and it might sound quite unbelievable today, under really different reigning circumstances. Due to the fact that most Benin collections are not owned by the museums themselves, but by communities, cities, or nations, each museum having different constituency and some of them underlying laws of inalienability of collections. And so the earlier plan was to give permanent loans, something that might seem absurd from an outside perspective today, considering the violent history behind these works, and which definitely was also difficult to argue for publicly, particularly in Nigeria. But for the group, at that point, it was a strategy agreed upon, and for some members, it might still be the way forward at this moment in time. Unless there is a legal system in place or the political will for restitutions, it cannot happen. And so this was the way forward that we envisioned to enable a return under the reigning conditions at that moment in time. And we expected that other developments would have been engendered by this step. At the time, there duly was a lack of understanding on the political level and in the public opinion to enable restitution processes, and there seemed no urgencies in those circles. Doubts were spread in the public arena about the safety of the objects once returned and the condition of Nigerian museums, etc., that we had to work against to convince the stakeholders of our museums in Europe. In the meanwhile, The political framework has changed considerably in some countries, while in others, despite all the attention the subject received in public debates, there is still hesitation. Things are changing, and some of the partners' museums will be in a position to restitute. Compared to the moment when we started in 2010, this is a huge development. Also, the fact that nearly all European museums owning Benin works and want to contribute to the Imowa Museum carried by the recently founded Legacy Restoration Trust and driven specifically by the governor of Edo State, Godwin Obaseki, was a significant step ahead, we all felt. The Benin Dialogue Group basically took practical, pragmatic steps from the inside, while radical aspirations in the ensuing debate in the media and through activists and NGOs created public pressure. I would see these two avenues as complementary actions, and both are necessary. Each one alone would not necessarily yield results. We always conceived the permanent loans as a strategy to make things happen in a first step, albeit there might have been different opinions about permanency within the group. Once the project succeeds in enabling the presence of prominent works in Benin City from European museums, this will definitely be a key moment and further other developments. The emotions associated with this moment will have a deep and decisive impact on future decisions on the political level throughout the world, if they have not been taken already then. 2 days ago, the news spread that Germany will restitute Benin works, and that a representative of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs was in Nigeria for conversations about supporting the Imowa Museum plans, archaeological research and restitution of Benin treasures to Nigeria. And yesterday, the steering committee of the Benin Dialogue Group issued a statement in reaction to recurring misrepresentations of the group's achievements, with which I would like to conclude my input. The statement reads: the Benin Dialogue Group recognizes that the looting of Benin City in 1897 is the main source of objects from the Benin Kingdom now held by museums all over the world. We acknowledge the deep loss this event caused. European member museums of the Benin Dialogue Groups are seeking to address the issues of return and restitution within their own governance structures. There are different laws that apply in different countries to the field of culture and the return of cultural objects. Members of the Benin Dialogue Group have, as a condition of being in the group, all agreed to support a major reunion of the Benin works of art in Benin City. Meanwhile, conversations are developing at a different pace in the various countries for initiating permanent returns. The concretizing plans for the Inou Museum of West African Arts in Benin City and the agreements between the National Commission for Museums and Monuments Nigeria, the Royal Court of Benin, the government of Edo State, and the newly founded Legacy Restoration Trust are crucial steps to prepare the ground for the future reception of returned artworks, their exhibition and safekeeping. The process is being undertaken in partnership with the member museums of the Benin Dialogue Group and is accompanied by provenance and essential archaeological research, curatorial exchange, contributions to museum planning and fundraising endeavors. The Benin Dialogue Group continues to function as the crucial network for sharing and channeling information, coordinating communication, and advising museums worldwide on how to contribute or restitute works to this unique museum in the making. The Digital Benin project, as a further outcome of the Benin Dialogue, is surveying and listing Benin collections and concomitant documentary and photographic archives for a future online platform for research and overview of the worldwide scattered royal treasures. In the future, it will be hosted by the Imowa. Thank you very much.
Hello, My name is Christine Mullen-Kramer, and I serve as the Deputy Director and Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African Art, where I've worked since 2000. For those unfamiliar with our history, the Museum of African Art was founded in Washington, D.C. in 1964 as a private museum dedicated to education and cross-cultural communication. Our first home, seen on the left, was located in a Capitol Hill townhouse formerly owned by renowned abolitionist and statesman Frederick Douglass. We became part of the Smithsonian Institution in 1979 and opened the new museum on the National Mall in 1987, seen on the right. You might be interested to know that in 1973, our pre-Smithsonian Museum played a central role in the repatriation of an African work of art, referred to in the literature as the Afo-Akam, that was looted in the 1960s from a royal repository in Lycom, Cameroon. The object of our focus is on the far left of the group photo, and it's shown in color at the center. Missing for years, the object finally came to light when it appeared on the cover of a 1973 catalog for an exhibition, Royal Art of Cameroon, at Dartmouth College, where it had been loaned by a New York art dealer. Our museum's founding director, Warren Robbins, seen at the far left, served as an intermediary to secure private funds to purchase the Afo-Akam from the dealer and return it to Cameroon. As seen in the upper left, the object was displayed briefly at our old museum prior to its crating, and then the crate was strapped into a business class seat on a plane bound for Cameroon. Members of the local community, dignitaries, and invited guests assembled to witness the object's uncrating. On the left, lower left, the object wrapped in bubble wrap begins to emerge from its packing crate. This must have been such a dramatic moment. And on the right, local dignitaries gather for a photo op around the object atop its packing crate. Today, our collection includes more than 12,000 works of art, ranging from 13th century historical works to contemporary commissions. Approximately 1,200 of these artworks are classified as modern or contemporary, with some entering the collection as early as 1966, long before the field of African art history turned its attention to this area of African artistic practice. Objects come into the museum's collection through purchase, donation, commission, bequest, and transfer, and they reveal histories of object creation and circulation that merit our discussion, time permitting, that inform the development of processes guiding restitution and repatriation. Accession into the collection is guided by internal, Smithsonian-wide, and international regulations and guidelines noted here, including the 1970 UNESCO Convention and the bilateral agreement between the United States and Mali. Provenance research is an essential part of the acquisition process. Much public, scholarly, and media attention is focused on the repatriation of Africa's looted art, especially objects from the Kingdom of Benin. But the return of objects to their communities or sites of origin is part of a larger process of restitution. The larger issues that the process of restitution should address, in my opinion, are equity, inclusion, decision-making power, and true partnership, areas of intellectual and professional engagement that have historically excluded the equitable participation of Africa's museums, scholars, public intellectuals, and community spokespersons regarding their cultural heritage. Objects are forms of access to knowledge and memory that are disrupted for future generations when objects are removed from their places of origin. And that point is central to calls for restitution and repatriation of Africa's colonial era collections, including objects that were looted. That memories, histories, knowledge systems, meaning-making, traditions, and the making of new traditions and memories are disrupted by the absence on the continent of Africa's tangible and intangible cultural heritage. As an example, the image on the left shows a Luba ritual specialist whose recitation of Luba history requires literacy in a vast body of knowledge that is facilitated by the use of a memory board called a lukasa, seen at the right. Object and knowledge are connected and inform each other. The loss of the object impacts the transmission of knowledge that the object embodies. As seen in the photographs on the right, in 1897, thousands of objects were looted from the Benin Kingdom Royal Palace in a raid undertaken by British forces. Eventually, many of these objects were acquired by museums throughout the world. On the left, you see how some of the royal plaques in our collection are currently displayed in our exhibition entitled Visionary: Viewpoints on Africa's Arts. The display of Benin Kingdom artworks in our Visionary exhibition includes the text shown here. I have underlined and emphasized keywords to emphasize our museum's intention to communicate to visitors how these objects came to be in museum collections, looted from the kingdom in 1897 as spoils of war, that eventually made their way onto the market and into private and museum collections around the world. We also indicate that the objects remain contested today, with some Nigerian scholars, museum professionals, and the Royal Court of Benin advocating for their return. The National Museum of African Art has 42 objects in its collection that are attributed to the Benin Kingdom. All are accessible via our online object database, which includes object provenance. Most have been published. In the two artworks shown here, their provenance documents their removal in the 1897 raid on the Benin Kingdom. Here are two more examples of Royal Benin arts in our collection with provenance information that is incomplete. It notes acquisition prior to the UNESCO convention, but does not conclusively document that they were looted in the 1897 raid. Provenance research is essential to the process of restitution and repatriation and requires ongoing dedicated research based on historical evidence and new scholarship. For example, our provenance research conducted a few years ago concluded that an object, seen in the upper left, published and identified as Yoruba, that came into our collection in 1986, was actually one part of an 8-segment hip ornament said to have been worn by the legendary 15th or 16th century warrior chief Inou from the Kingdom of Benin. The 8 segments were photographed in the 1950s and 60s outdoors on a cloth backdrop at the National Museum, Benin City, seen on the upper right. But it was unclear to us if the objects formed part of its collection or were simply photographed on the museum's ground. A 1969 descriptive catalog of the Benin Museum holdings listed but did not illustrate an object referred to as the bronze girdle of Inou, a legendary warrior chief. However, a circa 1950 photograph of Benin Museum displays, shown on the lower right, shows all 8 segments of the hip ornament arranged with labels on the top shelf, along with objects attributed to Benin Kingdom royals, including Inou. In 2017, we alerted our Nigerian colleagues at the National Commission and the National Museum of Benin City to our findings, and we await their decision regarding the disposition of an object that was clearly part of their collection some 7 decades ago. To date, we have not received a request from the Oba of Benin or his representatives, or from Nigeria's National Commission of Museums and Monuments for the return of any Benin Kingdom objects in our collection. This may be due to the solid relationship we have with members of the Royal Court of Benin, some of whom have visited our museum and toured our exhibitions and object and photographic collections, or the fact that information about the limited number of Benin Kingdom objects in our collection is available via our publications and our online collection database. In addition, the repatriation of all Benin Kingdom artworks may not be a goal of the Oba of Benin and his kingdom. In December 2019, I happened to see a BBC television program on the Benin Kingdom. It featured the current Oba, who shared his perception that a limited number of royal objects held in Western museums can, in his words, serve as effective cultural ambassadors that tell an important story of a powerful African kingdom that remains vibrant in Nigeria today. So what are some of the strategies museums in the United States might consider to move this initiative on restitution and repatriation forward? The first is for us to embrace an open, honest, and transparent dialogue with our African peers about the realities and enduring impact of colonialism and the role of restitution and repatriation in addressing this history, ensuring that stakeholders who have often been denied a voice in these matters are truly heard. Shared collection strategies are among the topics currently being discussed at the Smithsonian as part of a working group formed to develop a policy and process guiding the restitution and repatriation of colonial era and looted objects in Smithsonian Museum collections. This work will build upon existing processes, such as those outlined at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian and as part of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, and on procedures developed to research and return objects looted from collections during the Nazi era. We will also participate in the Digital Benin project, which I'm sure will be discussed. Essential to the success of any strategy regarding restitution is sustainability in working with partners on the African continent to share digital and object collections, to create and circulate joint exhibitions, and to strengthen museums and the wider cultural sector such that claims of restitution and repatriation can be mounted and sustained. A good example of partnership is our project on the photography of Chief Eso Olonge, the photographer of the Court of Benin for over 60 years. Led by our museum's archivist, Amy Staples, it was developed in collaboration with our Nigerian colleagues and with travel in mind. And after its 2-year showing at our museum, the exhibition then opened in the fall of 2017 as a permanent exhibition at the National Museum in Benin City. So let me conclude by emphasizing that we're at a pivotal moment in our museum practice, where we have the opportunity to address sustainably the issues that restitution and repatriation raise, and to change the way we do business with the source communities whose tangible and intangible heritage resides in our museum collections. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I look forward to our discussion to follow.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this symposium on the cultural heritage of the Kingdom of Benin. I represent an organization called the Legacy Restoration Trust, which was set up in Nigeria last year as an independent, non-profit entity focused on establishing the new Edo Museum of West African Art to be built in Benin City in Nigeria. The trust is also seeking to be a catalyst and an enabler for the return of objects, working closely with our stakeholders, namely the National Commission of Museums and Monuments, the Edo State Government, and the Benin Royal Palace. I'd like to discuss today's topic from a, more practical viewpoint. Let me set aside for today the very large issue about why these objects should be reunited or returned. I'm sure that many of my fellow panelists can address this issue. I'm going to make the perhaps naive assumption or hopeful assumption that there are institutions and individuals in possession of objects that are willing to consider the return of those objects. And our mission, therefore, is to work with such institutions towards the successful return. The trust aims to be an enabler and a partner for those considering restitution of objects, and in this regard, to try to address concerns that these institutions might have, while at the same time ensuring that the goal of our stakeholders and the Nigerian public are achieved. I think the most useful contribution that the Legacy Restoration Trust can make to today's discussion is perhaps to clarify what would be done with the artworks when they are once more in Benin City, and also to explain more how the Trust can enable and support institutions who have a genuine desire to explore how to return objects. An objection or concern that is very often raised in the restitution discussion is related to the quality of museum infrastructure in Africa generally. The argument typically is that an object may be better off in a Western museum with advanced security, climate control, storage, and display systems than return to a location which lacks the facilities and infrastructure. So one of the key objects of the Legacy Restoration Trust is to establish a world-class institution and infrastructure with the relevant facilities that address these sorts of concerns, but at the same time is relevant to local audiences and the local context. A picture of this future institution began to emerge publicly last November when the Legacy Restoration Trust and the visionary architect who's our collaborator, Sir David Adjaye, together with the governor of Edo State, made an announcement about the museum that is to be developed in Benin City. With the cooperation of Edo State government, the Benin Royal Court, and the Nigerian National Commission for Museums and Monuments, and with the participation of communities in Benin City, we are working towards the creation of the Edo Museum of West African Art, or EMOA. At the November 2020 announcement, we made it clear that EMOA is intended to be much more than a storehouse and an exhibition gallery for historic Benin objects. It is also intended to be much more than a standalone building. This project begins in the urban fabric of today's Benin City and also in the fabric of the 1,000-year-old city that was raised in the punitive expedition. The first step in creating EMOA is to undertake the most extensive archaeological excavation in the history of Benin City. With the cooperation of international partners, we are going to uncover what we can of the earthworks that characterize the Kingdom of Benin, the walls and the moats and the ancient gates. David Adjaye and the Nigerian architects with whom he will collaborate intend to use these archaeological interventions to restore and elevate ancient and historical features within today's urban landscape. They will also relate them directly to the museum site, which will be a compound or a complex rather than a single building. The archaeological interventions will restore a sense of past to a city that will also be receiving major improvements of infrastructure with the cooperation of Edo State government. The architectural design that David Adjaye is proposing makes this connection one of its guiding principles. So when visitors come to see EMOA, they will look into what promises to be one of the world's most fabled art collections, but they will also look out and see today's Benin City while tracing the restored borders of an ancient kingdom. Our goal is to develop EMOA as a cultural and curatorial institution, a center for research and education, widely accessible archives, home for local communities, social and cultural events, and a centerpiece of a revitalized Benin City that is resuming its place on the international stage. It will honor, preserve, and exhibit artworks commonly known as the Benin Bronzes, but it will also draw links with other artwork that the tradition of Benin art has influenced and inspired, both ancient as well as modern. EMOA will also be very notably a museum of contemporary art from West Africa and perhaps the African diaspora that emerges from this tradition. The museum will not attempt to be a comprehensive collection, but in recognition that the Kingdom of Benin was a multi-ethnic empire, EMOA will not confine itself to collections and exhibitions of works made in Benin City, past and present. It will seek to work with artists and artisans in today's Benin City who are continuing to work in metal, wood, ivory, and other media. Benin still has traditional artisans' quarters. We want to be connected to them, and we want to show the continuity between ancient culture of the Kingdom of Benin and the work being made today. So this is the vision, a very practical vision that we are seeking to realize. To put this back in the context of the restitution discussion, the Legacy Restoration Trust through the establishment of IMOA, intends to address the concerns about facilities, security, infrastructure very squarely with a world-class design museum complex. Aside from establishing IMOA, the Legacy Restoration Trust also intends to play another enabling role in the area of restitution. Very often, discussions of restitution get bogged down with issues related to ownership claims. To whom should we return the objects is quite often the question asked by people considering restitution. Because our stakeholders include the National Commission of Museums and Monuments, which is effectively the federal government of Nigeria, the government of Edo State, and the Royal Benin Palace, all of the relevant parties that are involved with the restitution discussion provide input and are represented in the trust. The trust, therefore, seeks to act as an agent and a custodian for all three parties, such that an international institution seeking to return an object can deal with one counterparty, and we function as essentially a clearinghouse and take on the responsibility of ensuring that all three parties are satisfied with restitution arrangements. We hope that by providing a one-stop shop and an authorized counterparty, the trust can act as a catalyst for the expedited return of objects and work with international parties in an efficient way. I'd like to conclude by giving my sincere thanks to those who are helping us achieve this vision, and I look forward to welcoming you before many years pass to the Edo Museum of West African Art, EMOA. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. So in the time available to me today, I want to talk to you about some of the myths that have surrounded the question of the return of the Benin objects, of those objects that were taken in 1897. And I guess the first thing I want to say is that I come into this conversation from a certain position. And my positionality is not only as a white male at an elite institution, the University of Oxford, which has incredible funding, which holds one of the more significant of the world's collections of those objects that were taken in 1897, about 145 or so. But it's also a positionality in which I have access to knowledge and to training, which means that this esoteric ability to talk about the provenance of objects, to work out, as I do in my book, the locations of where the more than 10,000 objects that were taken in 1897 have found their way to look at the military history, to find how the history of anthropology is sort of wound up with the history of museums and the history of violence. That is knowledge which at this moment in history, this moment in which we find ourselves, I think it's enormously important to share. So that's why I'm here, and that's why it's me speaking, on this sort of part of the topic. And I guess I want to first start with the notion that we hear quite a lot, that this is a new debate, that this is something someone just thought up sort of last year, or in the history of the Dialogue Group for Benin, or more recently. The question of restitution is an African-led movement and always has been. In the case of the Benin objects, the first objects were returned as early as 1938. Here on the left-hand side, you can see an image of Oba Okentua II receiving the coalwork crowns and robe in a return overseen from London. Here on the right-hand side, the pioneering work in advance of the 100-year anniversary, the Bernie Grant work, the campaign that he led, which now we approach the 125-year anniversary, is really ongoing. So it's crucial for us to remember that this is a conversation which we are only the most recent part of, and that the resolution of this question has to understand itself as a part of a long-term African-led movement. And so the second thing I want to underline, and the book is the first attempt to give a provisional first list of objects, and the Digital Benin project, of course, will be taking that work to another level in terms of the documentation of where all these objects have found their way to. But for so many, this is thought about as actually all about the British Museum. Here on the left-hand side, you have the displays there, the famous displays, just a number of the more than 900 objects held there. But remember, that's only about 9% or so of the total number of objects that we know were taken. Here on the right-hand side, are the displays which are here at the museum. I'm actually in the museum, maybe just 80 yards away from this case, sort of right now. And as you'll see, there's a wide range of objects there, from the carved ivory tusks to the coral work and to the sculptures and so forth. We need to remember as well that so many of these objects are not on display. There's only up to 100 or so of the British Museum ones out of 900 on display, and it's so many other institutions around the world. The argument to retain objects because they need to be seen is undermined actually in the fact that so many are simply in the storerooms. A third thing we hear is that the bronzes are unsafe in Nigeria. But as my book underlines, they have been equally unsafe in the hands of the British, not least because of the attack of 1897 that destroyed so much of an ancient royal and sacred landscape. We only see a number of actually what was lost in terms of what's in museums now. We hear that objects would be sold off. We hear that objects, if they were returned to Nigeria, would be unsafe. They would be subject to war or to theft. Well, in fact, so many of the museums, and in a lot of ways, in the case of the second of the Pitt Rivers collections, the most important of the Benin collections made after 1897, have been sold off here in the West. They have been sold off as European museums have been shut down. And here on the right-hand side, a reminder that the Benin Bronzes in Liverpool and in Hull were themselves the subject of war that led to them being either damaged or destroyed in 1941 in the Blitz. And so a fourth argument would be that this whole conversation is a distraction from what the museums should be doing to address underrepresentation. We're incredibly white organisations, and to address anti-racism in general. What we're realising, though, now is that the image on the left-hand side, which is that sense that the taking of the bronzes was almost a sort of side effect, or a sideshow to the real thing about the military attack, or this image on the right hand side that reminds us of the sheer violence of the destruction of that landscape. Actually, what we're realizing now is that the taking of objects was about the removal of sovereignty. It was about an attack upon traditional religion. It was about the removal of art and culture, because we know in museums that art and culture really matters. And of course, it matters just as much now as it did in the 1890s. So at that time, anthropology was mortgaged to an ideology of sort of cultural supremacy. Here at the Pitt Rivers, it was a museum of what was called cultural evolution. The idea that exactly the same as the natural world evolves, somehow there's evolution in culture and art. That racist idea is inherent in our retention of objects when they were taken under this sort of circumstance, and when the return is asked for. And certainly here in Oxford, that was something that we were reminded of with the Rose Must Fall Oxford movement, that said that the Pitt Rivers is one of the most violent spaces in Oxford, reminding us that the displays are things that can be hurtful in the present for our audiences and for many who will not even walk into the museum because they know actually what is on display. I think the fifth thing I want to say, especially for an American audience, is that stolen objects do not stop being stolen simply because the Europeans and Americans who took them have sold them under legal processes. So the argument of so many American institutions is that they acquired them fair and square at auction or by gift. These were looted objects. They're not legal in that sense, in terms of the law of the Kingdom of Benin as it was being removed, or indeed according to the ethical principles with which these days we operate in the museum sector. And I guess the final thing to say is that returns are not about emptying museums. It isn't an attack upon museums. It isn't about the shutting down of museums because there's going to be nothing left. This, as we see already for restitution in the case of Holocaust spoliation, under very different historical circumstances, but for us as curators, actually a process that we understand, or for the return of human remains. It's a case-by-case approach. And the case, as we see with the decisions made at Aberdeen and elsewhere in Cambridge and so forth, the decisions right now for the Benin case are just overwhelming. The case is so overwhelmingly there, and I think, in my view, actually very clear. And so this is a fundamental shift we're seeing from a European perspective, where the Times of London, in a leading article only at the end of last month, has said that it supports the return of the object from Aberdeen. It supports the return of these objects that were looted. So things are changing, and I guess fundamentally my intervention here in writing the book and also in being here is really to say that the old line that restitution was what was called for from Africa and was resisted by the curators who know better, well, here I am as a curator who's saying that in this case we need to see the return of the Benin Bronzes. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for these wonderful, instructive, insightful presentations from your professional activist perspectives. There are a number of things that I would like to follow up on from the presentations. To think about Barbara's talk about the work of the Benin Dialogue Group, one of the issues that have come up with regards to the, I would call them for the moment, BDG, is precisely the fact that at the very beginning, it had restitution as one of the key questions that he wanted to grapple with. But then that was sort of put a little bit in the background towards the pursuit of what you've rightly described as more practical and feasible, right, questions, given the political context of the different countries in which you find these museums. And you rightly pointed out the question of the inalienability laws with which these institutions had to grapple with, right? The question that I'm wondering about at the moment then is, given what you also pointed out were the shifting political landscape, whereby we now have heard the political types state where they stand. You know, Germany, for instance, and Macron in another instance. both of whom have spoken since the BDG began its work. So I'm wondering how this shifting political landscape is impacting, if at all, the tactics, but especially the strategy of the BDG, right? Has restitution moved a little bit up from where it was a few years ago in terms of what you're centering, right, as part of the Benin Dialogue Group's work?
Yeah, I think I pointed it out in my statement that, and I did not speak in detail about it, but already a couple of years ago, it was clear that some museums would be in a position to move forward to restitute works, while others were not able or would not like to proceed that avenue. So both approaches are represented in the group and still are, because what we always underlined is that restitution is a bilateral process, and the dialogue as it itself cannot decide about restitution because there are so many countries and institutions involved, but it is a channel for information and sharing of knowledge, and also, I think what happens in one place has an impact on other places, as we witness today.
Thank you. Let me address Christine's presentation. And again, thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this conversation. As I mentioned earlier, I know how tough it is to speak, for or be seen to be speaking for an institution that is much broader than the National Museum for African Art. It's part of the Smithsonian institution. So rather than, push in the direction of, being seen to be speaking about Smithsonian's policy, could you talk a bit about the landscape, to the extent that you are familiar with, of discussions that are happening, maybe not publicly, but at least what are the sentiments on the part of US museums and institutions with regard to, or your colleagues, right? Without, of course, maybe naming names, but what are the kinds of conversations that are happening when American museums look to Europe and see what's going on there, right? How are they thinking about their own work and their own place within this conversation? I would really appreciate an insight, right, to that.
Yeah, thanks, Chika, for that question. It's a good one, and I can't really speak for all of my colleagues, but what I can say is that, we a number of us are very much committed to this whole idea of process when it comes to restitution and repatriation, and that there is a need among American museums to begin to join together to develop such frameworks. I think Philippe's sort of laying out of the structure of the trust is very helpful for providing that sort of mechanism for individual museums to engage in these dialogues, bilateral relations, as Barbara says, to begin to establish such processes of restitution, of which repatriation is a part. So I think there are many colleagues out there who recognize completely that the time is not only right, it's overdue for us to move forward with all due deliberate speed, to engage with the structures within our own specific museums, to understand what mechanisms are in place? How can we become, I would say, more flexible as a sector, but also as individual museums for considering the collections that are in our care, and thus to begin to engage in a real productive dialogue about these. And so I think the time is right for museums to join together. And I think our museum, the National Museum of African Art, with its focus entirely on the arts of Africa, can be a real central point in trying to link up with colleagues around the United States and elsewhere to begin to implement or to develop collectively and individually a process. I think this is something that we hope to develop or to begin to discuss at our triennial conference that's coming up virtually now, folks, so stay tuned, in June. But I think it's really a way for museums who're a little bit behind in this to feel that there are processes out there we can draw on as models, and then from there begin to forge our individual and also collective, heft to move forward in this. And the final thing I would say is, with this idea of sustainability, I think that when museums join together within the United States, internationally, with our colleagues on the continent, I think we can capture the attention of foundations and individuals who really want to work with us to establish processes that are sustainable for our colleagues on the continent, such that other kinds of museums, such as the trust it's developing, can be developed and sustained, because I think that's the real future and the real promise of this very important conversation that we're having today.
Thank you so much for that. I do really appreciate the what you say about the willingness and the readiness of the National Museum for African Art as the premier museum for African art in the United States. It might not have the most of the Benin Bronzes of American institutions, but this is its cultural backyard. And to the extent that it's willing to lead the process, perhaps even guide the direction of these conversations, however informal, but with a mind to begin to think about institutional implications, right, of these conversations, and especially the idea of linking with foundations in the United States, and they are very, really generous foundations that can be impactful in these conversations, in the processes of establishing a museum, the museum in Benin City. That would be really fantastic. And that leads me then to Philippe. Again, the work that your group is doing is really incredible, I must say, and precisely because you're trying to show that it can be done. And that brings me to the question: what are the major headwinds, if you will, the resistances that the Restoration Trust is encountering at the moment, quite apart from the usual one of finance, right? Because you have to raise the funds to make this a reality, and this is where you come in, given your stellar background in finance. But I'm wondering, what are the challenges the group is facing, arguing for this project, right? Is it all great and good? Or if you could talk a bit about how things are going, right, in terms of getting the support, emotional, political, cultural, and what have you, right, to support restitution broadly, but especially the work that you're doing with the establishment of the museum in Benin City.
Thank you for the question.
let's say the largest challenges that we face. The first challenge is working with our stakeholders to create a governance structure that they are all happy with, and getting delegated authority to ensure that we can do the work that we need to do. We're a fairly new concept. So we are an independent trust. We have board representation from all three of our main stakeholders, but the majority of the board are independent directors. And so it's a structure that isn't used often in Nigeria and hasn't been used in the cultural space much. We were driven to this structure in part because of the second challenge, which we have been working on, which is on the funding side. What we wanted to do is to have a structure that both international as well as local providers of capital would be comfortable with. So rather than raising money for the Edo state government or the Kingdom of Benin or NCMM, we are seeking to raise money, and we are raising money for the trust itself that will be directly accountable to all donors. But also, one of the things that has come out very clearly is because there are several institutions that need to work together, having one party that can act as a clearinghouse and as a custodian. I mean, the one thing for sure about the Legacy Restoration Trust is that we have absolutely no claim whatsoever to ownership of any of these objects because we've only been around for a year and a half. So our legitimacy is tied to being a steward for our three main stakeholders. And it's establishing that relationship, which is taking time. The third challenge we have, which is probably so far has been the easiest, is the interaction with institutions abroad. We are taking a pragmatic or a collaborative approach. So we are interested in having a dialogue. We're not interested in having a fight. We're not the organization that is going to be burning down your university. We are the institution that wants to sit down and have a conversation with you about how we can work together. Because for us, it's not about getting objects back, just about getting objects back. It is also about building an institution, and that requires collaboration.
Thank you so much. That's really important for our audiences to hear the really difficult, challenging, but necessary work that the Legacy Restoration Trust is doing. And I might add, since we have a second panel coming up later on, but this is for you, Philippe. There was the discussion by Christine about the object that they found in their museum, and she did mention that they've not heard from the Nigerian authorities. Perhaps this may come up in the second panel, but I would be very appreciative if you could make a note of this and sound out, the partners in Nigeria and say, hey, did you ever respond to this, inquiry from the National Museum of African Art? That'll be helpful, because this is the kind of work I believe that the Legacy Restoration Trust will necessarily be doing, right? To make sure that communication is flowing, like, across and between all the parties that are involved in this broader question about Benin and the royal arts of Benin. Let me come to you.
Chika? Hey, Chika, yes. I wonder if I can just add to that just for a moment.
Yes, please.
That our initial sort of information about that object in our collection went to, well, there have been just changes in leadership in the Director Generalship of the National Commission of Museums and Monuments. So I believe that information has been passed on, and we're looking very much forward to engaging with the current leadership, because I think, that's where things tend to delay when there's shifts in leadership. And I think now we've got, very good people in place and ready to run with this.
Thanks, Christine, for that. So, Dan, let me come to you. The very clear way that you've articulated the myths, right? These were some of the supposedly most compelling arguments that scholars of some influence or great influence have made over the years why these objects could not be returned. So thank you for taking them head on and showing, perhaps even more compellingly so, why these are just simply what they are, and that's as myths rather than as legitimate arguments against restitution. And that then leads me to wonder, yes, since your book came out, what's going on with you and your colleagues, right, in the museum world? Are you now, like a pariah, or do they see you as this, voice that will lead us out of this, dark places that we've been, these many decades? So what are you, a pariah, or, the visionary voice of the Western museums that are keeping Benin Bronzes?
Sure. Absolutely. Well, I mean, maybe actually neither of those two things, I hope, in some ways. I mean, there is no doubt that there is a shift across the generations in museums. So really, we now have here in Europe, and I know certainly in America as well, there are leaders in the cultural sector who understand how important this issue is and are moving on it. So the old idea, which in some ways you're sort of having to ask that, underlines that restitution, as I said in my talk, is somehow an attack on the museum, weirdly sort of inverts the fact that these objects are here because, of an attack in the first place. So this really is an evolution of how we operate in museums. It's already mainstream, for Holocaust restitution, for which the law was changed here in the UK. It's already, what we do all the time for ancestral human remains. It's always been an anomaly that African objects are not a part of these conversations, where we in the UK have, exactly as in North America, have seen for Indigenous, First Nations, Native Americans, Aboriginal Australians, actually this has been a normal part of what we do. So I'm really, obviously there will be some who want to pull this into a sort of culture war sort of idea, but that's only a bit of the media, really. And I think increasingly a very, an argument that doesn't really wash. So, I think our museums are evolving, and we've never needed something like a World Culture Museum more, where we can see art outside of that old sort of a Eurocentric lens. But that doesn't mean that our museums should have things that should be elsewhere.
Thank you so much. I think part of the reason why the discussions around restitution in other world areas have not quite caught on with Africa, I think it's because most of these institutions didn't think that it mattered, right? Didn't feel enough pressure to do much about Africa. We do know that that's what museums and institutions largely respond to: pressure from the right kind of quarters. And I think that the shifts that we've had in the recent years, the Black Lives Matter movement is very important in the internationalization of the fate of objects looted during the colonization of the African continent. So I think that quite apart from the generational shift, which is quite significant when we think about museum leadership, it was I think it was 2002, right, when the directors of the big museums in Europe and in the United States made what I call the infamous defense of the so-called universal museums against a restitution of objects. I doubt that the current crop of directors of these same institutions will be willing or moved enough to sign such a document in the present day. So I think that these two paths have sort of met at the right time, and that's why I think that all the players that we have on the screen right now, that your work is so important in this very moment, and we need to seize the opportunity to move the needle from where it's been for the longest time. And having said that, let's then go into questions. We have a few questions from our audience, and I'll go through them as they have come in. Some are addressed to all the parties, and some are clearly directed at one or other of our panelists. The first question is this. It says, what is the current, and I think this is for Christine, what is the current position of the Smithsonian regarding repatriation of, I think you spoke to this a bit, but if there's more that you want to elaborate on, that would be great. Are they currently in any talks, or do they plan to work with government and or directors? I think the latter part is the key one that I would like you to take on. Are you planning to work or in a position to work with the director or curators of the new museum being planned for Benin?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And, first of all, the Smithsonian does have a process underway to develop, a policy and a framework, not just for Africa, but for other, areas of the world connected to looted and colonial era collections. So, we want that process in place, and we certainly welcome and will engage with government organizations and museums on the continent with regards to this. We have a very good relationship in Benin City, thanks to our Alonge project and other sort of longstanding relationships we've had. And our museum is very, prepared to address any question that comes to us regarding our collections, and to engage in these fruitful discussions that Philippe has laid out about the disposition of collections and, what we should be doing about them. I think, Philippe's organization, the Trust, can play such a leadership role in guiding not just our museum, but other museums in the United States about these questions and moving forward. So, we have processes in place at the Smithsonian with regards to Native American material, objects looted during the Nazi period, but we need a broader process that addresses these very collections that you speak about. I don't know if I've answered your question entirely, but
yes.
Well, the other thing I would say is the Smithsonian is, of course, in some ways sort of like a ministry of culture, if you will, though we don't have such a thing in the United States. But that means that our relationships are sort of government to government in many ways. And so we want to link up with, those institutions on the continent that, have these kinds of authorities, because that's where the first sort of engagements need to begin. But then, of course, the broader sort of community concerns, stakeholder concerns, we also take very much to heart as part of, best practices.
Thank you so much. Now, the next question, I guess, is kind of speculative. It says, realistically, as far as the members of the panel are concerned, will the British Museum, even on the basis of a long-term loan, give up any of its Benin Bronzes collection? So this is about, I know none of us here is representing the British Museum. So I guess this is aspirational. Whatever your response is might be aspirational. So could anyone take a bite at this?
I'll take a bite because I can see my
Yes.
colleagues are not willing to. So, as some of you may know, the first phase of work that the trust is involved with is an archaeological project. So the site where the museum is to be built is right in the heart of the cultural part of the city. And there's very little archaeological work that's been done in Benin. So the first phase is to actually do some archaeological work. And one of our partners is the British Museum. And so we have a ongoing, very intensive involvement with the British Museum. I would say we would not have them as a partner in this project if we did not believe that the British Museum would be looking genuinely at the return of at least some of the Benin bronze objects. I don't want to say more than that. But,
sure. Yes, thank you for that. It's important that you mentioned that, but also I saw recently, I'll come to you briefly, Barbara, but I did see a statement from the current director, right, of the British Museum, where he indicated a willingness, right, to enter into discussion about restitution. This is phenomenal, right? Even the statement of a willingness to engage in these conversations. So alongside the important archaeological project that you mentioned, Philip, I think that one could reasonably see the British Museum participating more frontally in the processes and discussions around restitution going forward. Barbara, please.
Yes, I also just wanted to add to what Philip was saying, that the British Museum has been a crucial part of the Benin Dialogue from its beginnings. So, and is very supportive of everything that is going on in Benin City right now. So I think it will be also contributing majorly to this future project.
Thank you. So the next question is this. Edo is an exceptional case because there's such a clear historical record of the theft. Given this exceptionalism, to what degree can Edo serve as a model for broader restitution policies? And if so, how? Any thoughts, Dan?
Yeah, and so I wonder if I can have a go at that one.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, I think there is a risk with the focus, I think the necessary focus as we start to talk about African restitution, there is a risk of the focus on this example because the evidence is overwhelming. And in a lot of other cases where restitution claims are made, the same level of evidence will not actually exist, but that should not hold back an openness to, as I say, an approach which is a case-by-case approach, but is able to look at other instances. And so the Macron report underlines the fact that there are other ways that objects found their way from Africa archaeological objects that were excavated, things that were even actually either bought or exchanged. And there's a question there over consent, which was introduced in that important work, in that important report. So absolutely, I think the case has been made, here in this instance, but we need to look also at a continental level. I think on a positive side, though, the reason, I think a thing that will happen because of this conversation, because of the sheer international reach of the bronzes, that means that there's now a conversation about returning them in 150 or more museums absolutely around the world, in Ivy League institutions, in a whole host of other museums, sort of internationally. So that means African restitution, is a conversation that's happening. So for that reason, I think, we can be hopeful.
Yes, Barbara.
Yeah, and maybe another thing that I think, and it certainly is an exceptional case, but I think the whole process could be a model also, because also for other African holdings throughout the world, there is one factor that I think now what is going on in Nigeria in the conversations that the various stakeholders are having in creating in this also the trust to enable return to the community where the objects came from. This certainly is important and will be important also for other African countries, because there is an issue between nation and communities concerned. And so these getting together to find a solution, how that can be approached, this certainly has a model character.
Yes, and I think that there's something more to be said about that. Yes, it is exceptional, but it also the fact that the name recognition of Benin and the history of colonial violence is very important in the, if you will, the moral arguments that have been made about restitution, right? And so it serves as a model in that sense. It's not the only kingdom that was burned down. The Ashanti Kingdom, the Dahomey, and several others that were destroyed by the colonial powers in the process of the so-called pacification of the African continent. And so it provides a model in that sense. It's also, and I think this is again where the project of the Legacy Restoration Trust comes in, that it's also showing a model, right, of what happens on the other end, which is to say that you have Africans who are not just asking for the return, they're doing something concrete about it to say, we're asking for the return and we need these things to come back, and we are establishing the grounds for taking care of them. And I must mention, though, that the Legacy Restoration Trust, I don't believe, is doing this to please the European museums and so forth who are keeping the Benin objects. They are doing it because they want to do it for the Edo people, for the palace, for Nigerians, for West Africans, right, for themselves. And this is important in terms of thinking about models. I'm aware that the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation is spearheading a similar project in Senegal, the Bet B Museum project that is coming on stream, which will act in a similar role as the Legacy Restoration Trust. So in that sense, I see the possibility of other similar institutions emerging on the continent to support this broader question of restitution. So let's take I think we have a bit more time. Let's take the next question, and this is for Dan. Can you update us on the status of repatriation discussion within Oxford relative to recent pronouncements from Jesus College, Cambridge, and the University of Aberdeen? So what's Oxford doing? about
Yes, absolutely. Of
restitution?
course I can. So I can't speak officially for the university. And I think the first thing to say is that Oxford, exactly like so many other institutions worldwide, this is a question for trustees. And lots of what we hear about the legal restrictions simply do not apply to the university museums and to many other museums which are not which are not, if you like, national museums. So what Oxford has done is it has adopted a procedure. So that was adopted in August last year for what to do when a claim is made for the return of an object which is in either our libraries or obviously here in the museums. And I think it's a good one. I think it's a policy that certainly does not say that things are loaned back. This is about the permanent return. It does not say things have to be on display or all these other things. It's a document which is written very much in the spirit that if you give something back, you give it back. You don't have some further interest in what happens next. There is then the question, as was raised earlier, of the university may say, and I don't know, if it would at this point, but the university may say, well, we haven't received a demand, and I think we have to get those sort of over that hump fairly soon. We have to start saying, well, how often does Nigeria have to ask for returns in order to be told that the wrong person has asked, or they've addressed the wrong person, or whatever? I think that is an argument that doesn't really hold water at the moment. But certainly we are open to dialogue institutionally, and I obviously, as an academic, have that academic freedom to give my expert opinion. And it is an opinion, but it is based on a long amount of work which I have done over the years in the museums and the heritage world, to say that I think that the returns are overdue and they should be a permanent return.
Thank you. I think I need to also, the point you make about it's all about the trustees, because they are the owners, right, of these museums that are not government museums like the Smithsonian, right? And that has been paradoxically one of the so-called important arguments that American museums have made over the years, that the Europeans, they are government owned and so forth. It's easy for the politicians to take decisions for them and what have you. I have often argued that it's actually easier for the American museums because they are owned by a few people, right? The so-called trustees of the, and all they need to do is to convince the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 people who own the museums as the trustees to move the needle, right? So that's very important.
If I could just add there,
yes,
I think it's incredibly important for audiences and for those who love their museum locally to raise this. So anybody watching this, just think about how near you are to one of these objects right now. How far is it? And there's a list in the back of my book, and there will be, of course, increasing amounts online. We need this to be, it is a conversation that will happen in a different way, here in Oxford as compared to New York or sort of anywhere in the world. But we need it to be led not only by those in museums, but also from audiences.
Here's a question for Philippe. It might be someone who who has money. Who knows? That's why I'm picking this question, right? So it says the target for EMOA is it's still 2025, which gives you only 4 years, and asks, what is the exact status of the funding for EMOA? How much has been raised to date? And what is your target? So that's why I think this might be someone with money who might be wanting to help.
Well, what we have done is we have split this project into different phases. So the first phase is a fundraising that we launched to undertake what we're calling the early works. So that is the archaeological work, a storage and research pavilion, because what we'd like to do is to be able to receive objects and store them in advance of the main museum itself, to set up a project office in Benin, which we have done now. And for that, we were looking in the region of about $10 to $15 million. And we have now received commitments equal to or slightly in excess of that. We have raised money in Nigeria, which I think is really important, but we also have raised money with international partners. But we're in the very early part of this journey. The second phase will be for the museum itself, but we will not be approaching institutions and individuals until we have finished the business case and the costings and so on. So that's going to take time. So we are hoping by the end of next year to be in to have received commitments for the museum itself. That's what our target is.
Okay, thank you for that. There's a question from another member of the audience. This is a broader question about. It says, "What are we supposed to do about objects not in museums but in private hands?" And does anyone have any thoughts about that? Of course, we've seen private collectors make the move of returning objects that had been handed over from some ancestor. And so there are private collections and private collectors that are taking their own initiative to return objects. And I hope that others will follow suit. I think also as they see museums engage in conversation about restitution, they will think less about gifting those works, these Benin objects to the museums, right? Rather than just send it back to Benin. So I think that on the one hand, there are already models existing of private collections that are initiating restitution. But if they look to museums that are engaged in restitution processes and debates, maybe they will be encouraged to engage directly with the Legacy Restoration Trust. I think, David, did you have your question ready? Otherwise, there's a question about a visitor to the Met says that there's little contextual information about the Bronzes and the 1897 loots when he visits such museums as the Met in New York. Aside from restitution, what kind of curatorial best practices might be encouraged at encyclopedic museums like the Met, and how might these changes be implemented? I hope, Christine, if you could, since you are working in a similar museum, well, not in the scale of the Met, but in terms of best practices, right, about documentation and information that are given to museum audiences.
Yeah, Chika, there's a couple of points that I might make on that. One is
Sure.
that, having access to the collections through online collection information is one way for the public to actually understand a lot more about an object than is often possible to put on a museum label. And so that's where these online databases are so important, with full provenance, when it's known or what's known about the provenance indicated there. Secondly, as a couple of my slides showed in the presentation, thinking very carefully about how to communicate to visitors within the style of your museum, because some museums have more text, some have less text, and so on. But thinking about how to inform visitors about these contested objects and the historical factors of how objects make their way into collections, can be conveyed, in a minimum of words, but, through word and image, not shying away from that and thinking very carefully about the words that are used. For example, in our visionary exhibition, the joint curators, Karen Milbourne and Kevin Dumichel and I, really discussed language and, chose the term the raid on Benin versus a punitive expedition, which sort of puts the sort of as if, the Benin Kingdom did something wrong versus, the violence, that, Dan has spoken about and that we know about that 1897 raid. So language is very important. And then finally, thinking about technology and how to deliver some of these very important stories about provenance, but also about the meaning of these objects in museum collections. I think technology can go a long way toward, delivering alternate or additional stories, I guess I would say, about objects in museum collections. So in our exhibitions now, we have a technology called Hi, and you access it with your smartphone, but it provides additional information, whether it's additional text and a historical image or a videotape. So one could well imagine that museum practice down the line, in the not too distant future, is really beginning to tackle the stories by which museums make their way into the collections. And that's something that Dan alluded to in his comments earlier, that, some objects come in as gifts from one, from an African ruler to a colonial civil servant or a colonial military officer as part of negotiations, and positioning. So it's sort of a strategy that, rulers have used on the continent. Others make their way in as objects that are commissioned for, explicitly for export to the outside as tourist objects or as gifts. And then others are, acquired through these other processes that do raise these moral and ethical concerns about power imbalance and how even the simplest of objects, used in everyday context, but personally owned, what were the constraints that led to an individual relinquishing such objects? So I think thinking holistically about, first of all, our visitors and how they access collections, how, they're not going to want to read a book on a wall, but will want, limited label copy with the appropriate language that places, the burdens of history fairly out there, and clearly out there for visitors to understand and consider, and then to think about various technologies that can add multiple and diverse voices to these stories, but also add depth to the information that we're able to provide vis-a-vis provenance, but also the meaning of these objects, even if they're hundreds of years old, to the communities today.
Thank you. We have just 2 minutes. I should mention, Christine, especially because you talked about this, objects that left in recent years that were not looted. And I have one specifically in mind, and I want to use this platform to talk about it or mention it. And that is the bronze head that the military ruler of Nigeria, General Yakubu Gowon, in the 1970s gifted to the Queen of England. I would hope that the British government, the Queen, will return that object because it was taken by the military head of state, the dictator, from the museum straight to England against the wishes of the curators of the National Museum. And so I would hope that that head will be returned to Nigeria sooner rather than later. This is about we've come to the end of our panel. I want to use this occasion and this moment one more time to thank you, Barbara, to thank you, Christine, and to Philip and Dan. This has been a privilege of mine to engage in this wonderful, meaningful, substantive conversation about the fate of the Benin Bronzes and their return to Nigeria in the next several years. So thank you all so much. And thank you all to our audiences from wherever you are. We do appreciate your participating in this program. See you all sometime next time. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and good evening for those of you who are not in Eastern time. Welcome back. It's an honor for me to be moderating this panel for the second session of our conference. Before I introduce the panelists, let me just share very quickly an information. Currently, Senegal is celebrating the 100th birthday of Amadou Mahtar Mbow. Yes, the man is 100 years old and he is with us and in good shape. The reason I mention this is, of course, because of the role he played as Director General of UNESCO in the 70s. And in particular, the passionate advocacy he has presented for restitution, in particular in his 1978 speech, which was really a beautiful, passionate piece of eloquent calling, demanding actually the restitution of art, African art. And tomorrow, Saturday, there will be a webinar organized in Senegal on his action precisely in favor of the restitution of African art. And I'm mentioning also another piece of information. It is that Andreas Gorgon, who is Director of Cultural Affairs and who has played and is playing an essential role on the negotiation with Nigeria about the restitution, will be among us. He has accepted, out of friendship for Felwine Sarr, who will be there as well, and myself, he has accepted to be part of the conversation. And that conversation will be obviously also on the very important questions that are posed for this particular session, which are, so the title of this session is Restitutions and Returns, How, Why, and For Whom? And to answer these questions, we are very fortunate to have eminent scholars and professionals. Let me introduce them in the order in which they are going to appear. We will first have the two videos and then a presentation live. We might have technical problems having with us the second presenter, but hopefully the technical problems will be solved by the time we finish seeing the two videos and listening to the third presenter live. So our panelists are first Professor Felicity Podenstein. Professor Felicity Podenstein is an art historian teaching in France. She specialized in the history of archaeological and ethnographic collections. She's a lecturer at Sorbonne University, and she teaches history of museums and heritage studies. After starting her career as a researcher on the history of the collections of the Department of Coins and Medals at the National Library in Paris, she now works on questions of representation in the display of contested, translocated objects. And since 2015, she is dedicated to the study of the global destiny of the Benin pieces that have been looted in 1897. The second presentation will be by Professor Kokunre Abotain Egafona, who is a doctor in archaeology, specializing in cultural resource management and museum studies. On the academic side, she's been a lecturer at the University of Ife, which is now, as we know, Obafemi Awolowo, and also professor in the departments of sociology and anthropology at the University of Benin. And as a professional, she has worked as a museum intern at the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. And she has authored over 60 academic publications, mainly on Benin culture and tradition. Our third presenter for this session, who will be presenting live, as I said, is Professor Abba Issa Tijani. Abba Issa Tijani is the current Director General, Chief Executive of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria. Professor of Museology and Anthropology, Tijani is a former head of Department of Fine Arts and coordinating head of Departments of Creative Arts at the University of Maiduguri, who coordinated the collaboration between the University of Maiduguri and the Universities of Hamburg and Hildesheim in Germany. Until his current appointment, he was the acting director center at the Center for the Study of Cultural Sustainability, the University of Maiduguri, and the executive board of director and head Nigeria-funded project on performing sustainability, cultures, and developments in West Africa. So we will be welcoming first, as I say, the video, first from Professor Felicity Podenstein.
Okay, I'm going to jump right into this. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I won't make it long because I've been finding it quite difficult to break this down to 10 minutes. I'm going to briefly try and consider the history of requests for return of the Benin pieces before decolonization. Because it is a surprisingly long history, and I think that having an idea of that right now for the discussion that we're about to lead could be quite interesting. The first documents requested for return, or the first objects requested for return, and the first requests were made in 1935 by Oba Akenzwa II. As the second Oba to be named in colonial Benin, he was particularly active in the restructuring of traditional customs of court life, trying to reclaim a certain degree of independence from the control exerted by the colonial administration, reconciling Christian practices with religious belief systems of pre-colonial Benin. In particular, he established one large major festival, the Igwe Festival. And one of his most important actions that the Oba needed to carry out was also to honor the ancestors, and in order to perpetuate his powers, he needed to visit their shrines during the different annual festivals, and in particular Igwe. According to a contemporary biographer of Akenzwa II, Osaro Edo, and I quote, "The reigning Oba had to wear the regalia of any Oba whose shrine was to be visited. The bone of contention here, as Osaro writes, was that a large number of artworks and beaded crowns had been stolen from the palace during the Benin punitive expedition of 1897, and most of the shrines could not be visited without these crowns. So the first requests made by Akenzwa II sought to recover specific objects that were necessary in the execution of essential court rites. In 1935, he met with the Earl of Plymouth in Benin City's Under-Secretary of State of the Colonies, and this visit led to an explicit request for the return of the regalia of Oba Wamraman, and in particular for 2 throne stools dating from the 16th and the 18th century. This story of these requests has been particularly well documented by Audrey Peraldi. The reference is here if you want to read more. So research was undertaken by the Foreign Office to ascertain where these objects were. It was figured out that they had been taken by Moore, the leader of the protectorate, of the expedition on the protectorate side, and they were finally located as part of the collections in Berlin. where they had been acquired in 1909 after Moore's death. A series of interactions and discussions with the museum, of course, led to a refusal of any kind of return or even resale of the objects, as the Oba had actually also offered to buy them for a reasonable price. What they did provide were 2 galvanoplastic copies of the thrones, which you can today actually see in the National Museum in Benin City. These copies carry an inscription that the Oba had asked to have inscribed, which is 1897 Benin Expedition War Trophy, now in the State Museum of Berlin. In parallel, other efforts were made to locate the regalia of Oven Ramen, and these were more successful. Here is an image showing one of the only few returns that actually happened, doubtlessly a kind of symbolic gesture in colonial politics, designed to soften perhaps the deception of the failed attempt at recuperating the throne stools. It was facilitated by the personal by a personal offering of G.M. Miller, the son of a member of the Benin expedition, who owned who had the choral regalia that you can see Akanzo II holding here. He had lent them to the British Museum. What's interesting is to see how this event, which was very much celebrated by Oba Akenzo II, and the celebration of which you can read also in the text by Osaru Edo on Akenzo II. What's interesting is that it was really set up to be an official affair, as if it had also been returned by the state, although it is actually a private return, just as the more recent return by Mark Walker, the grandson of an expedition member, of a certain number of objects in 2014. Today, this image is also at the entrance of the National Museum of Benin City, showing Akenzo II holding these objects dearly, but interestingly, the figures of the 2 colonial officials have been taken out. In that same year of this return, I won't call it a restitution because it isn't that, Kenneth Murray, who was working at the Education Department in Lagos, established a department to, and I quote, save Nigerian antiquities from destruction through human and natural agencies, and to create in Nigerians an awareness of the country's cultural heritage. He organized an exhibition of African art in London, which led the then Secretary of the Colonies, Ormsby Gore, to officially announce his intention to support this project. And also it led different members of the colonial administration to express the desire that gifts should be made so that a certain number of collections might return to the country, having left Nigeria in the past decades. So basically, they're asking private people to return objects. For Murray, the museum would help restore a sense of lost pride in local collections, and of all the groups in Nigeria and their associated objects, he considered the situation of the Benin court art to be particularly dramatic. At present, he says, it is easier to study Nigerian art in Europe than in Nigeria. Thus, for instance, while there are 2,000 pieces of old Benin sculpture in Europe, in Benin itself, there are only a dozen indifferent ones. So he he pushed very much these initiatives of museums to be created in Lagos, Benin, and Ife, and was named Surveyor of Antiquities in 1943. And his campaign to buy back some of the most important Benin pieces coming onto the art market needs to be understood in a process of collaboration with Jacob Egereva in Benin, and with whom he wrote the Benin Museum Collection's first catalogue. So there is a story that needs to be told here as well of Benin involvement in this collection building by Murray, which is something that we still need to do. So Murray begins his campaign to buy back these pieces in 1946, really, and that is the year when Akenzo II makes a donation to the city of Benin of a part of the collection that he has been himself establishing, including copies from foreign museums, in order to create a museum in Benin City. Murray goes out into the world and finds, support and connections with different people, in particular Bernard and William Fagg. William Fagg, who is working as a keeper at the Department of Ethnography at the British Museum, and who will help him make some important acquisitions. Just as a side note, to also refer back to the German collections, at this point, Murray and Bernard Fagg asked themselves whether it would not be possible to recuperate through the reparations system set up after the war in 1946 to get some of the German bronzes back as reparations for to the British, but that would go to British Nigeria. So just to say that this is also another strategy they had come up with to perhaps gain the two throne stools in particular, which had not been forgotten. So Murray corresponded with Bernard Fagg, who was also working in Nigeria, and his brother William. And all of this illustrates some of the intricacies and tensions of this collaboration between nascent colonial and metropolitan institutions, which is what this last little bit of my presentation will be about. Because this attempt to reverse the flow of cultural material out of Nigeria was of course bound to come into conflict with the continued development of major collections in Europe and North America. So Fagg indeed did serve as an intermediary to make some of the acquisitions for the Lagos National Museum, including this absolutely magnificent piece bought in 1953 for £5,500, which was a massive sum for the Nigerian authorities at the time. And I need to follow up on this, but a letter from Bernard Fagg indicates that it was actually Shell Oil that paid for this acquisition. So we also see the intervention of these major international companies coming into the story, something that I also need to look into more clearly. But where things got really complicated and didn't work out so well for the museum in Lagos was when it came to the sale or the arrival on the market of a mask, a very famous ivory mask today considered to represent Yoruba Idea, and which we now all know is at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's a very close pendant to the British Museum mask, of course. And both had been sold from Moore's collection in 1909. And one had gone to the British Museum and another had stayed in the private collection of the ethnographer Seligman. And Seligman's widow, after he died, proposed to sell the mask. And this is where the bidding began between different actors in the small world of African arts. It was seen as the piece to come onto the market. And Murray launched a kind of a system of subscriptions to help buy the piece in Nigeria, trying to gain funds, but of course could only make a relatively modest offer. William Fagg, meanwhile, had begun working for Rockefeller, who opened his Museum of Primitive Arts the same year as the Lagos National Museum opened in 1937. And William Fagg also had a great interest in the selling of the mask at a particularly high price, because the owner had promised to provide him with the money of the sale to save financially the Royal Anthropological Society. This meant that Fagg wanted to go to the highest bidder, and so he pushed for a presentation of the mask to the Museum of Primitive Art, to Rockefeller in New York. And that is basically why this famous piece did not go to Lagos, but went to New York. Art also goes where the money is in many ways. And of course, the Nigerian colonial government was entirely incapable of matching the offer made by Rockefeller of £20,000. So this is just to say that, in a sense, all of this is really, also, you should note that 2 other masks were sold in the immediate aftermath of this sale at extremely high prices. So all in all, £60,000 were exchanged for Benin Idea masks around the moment of independence itself, of decolonization. 2 European heritage institutions were saved financially through the sales of these objects. So I just wanted to note that this is all, in a sense, the backstory that we need to understand that explains how the masks became so well known in Nigeria and led, and followed a path that led them to becoming the emblem of Festac in 1977. In 1973, a new purpose-built museum opened to the public in Benin, hosting about 100 objects, many of which were copies that included plaster casts that William Fagg had sold to Murray in 1956. Also in 1973, the Nigerian delegation at the Assembly of ICOM in Grenoble, France, submitted a resolution specifically requesting donations to the new museum of 1 or 2 Benin items from museums and collectors who had sympathy for the looting of Benin treasures by the British in 1897. The request was transformed into a general appeal, but absolutely received no response at all. Bénédicte Savoy has recently published a text that shows how strong the wave of requests in the 1970s and 80s was. I have no time to go into these, of course, but I really wanted us to have this history of return before decolonization, showing that the topic occupying us today is one that has forged notions of heritage in Nigeria since at least the 1930s. Thank you very much for your attention.
My presentation is on an appraisal of public attitude towards the Benin Bronzes in Benin, Nigeria. I conducted a research in 2010 and I'm comparing the results of that research now in a fresh one in 2021. In July 2010, I attended a conference at the University of Manchester titled Museum and Restitution. My presentation was titled After Restitution, What Next? An appraisal of public attitude towards museum and museum objects in Benin City, Nigeria. And just before then, in 2009, there was this clamor for the return of Benin objects. It had gained momentum than in previous years, and I felt the need to go to the field to carry out research on the general public, what they felt about museum and the Benin Bronzes taken away in 1897, especially their return. We need to know about how the people feel concerning restitution, so we'll know how they will take care of the objects if they are returned, or their attitude towards going to museum or appreciating this art. And my research was based on the fact that over the years since 1936, when Oba Akenzwa II started this movement to request for the Benin objects through the museum, the museum, the federal government, all asking for it in the national level. And then my personal interest, I observed with a keen interest in 1977. I was then an undergraduate student of history at the University of Benin during this Festac 1977, Festac 77, and the federal government requested for the Festac 77 symbol, which was the pictorial mask of Queen Idia, and this from the British Museum, and this was turned down. And again, in commemoration of 1997, there was this conference we had, international conference we had in Benin, and also two fresh requests were made that were turned down, on and on, different requests. And one thing I found intriguing was that some curators said in some of the publications I read that they felt the objects, the Benin Bronzes, were safer outside than returning home. And also I was at the we had this Zoom meeting, the book launch of Barnaby Phillips. He casually mentioned about the moats that is there, that is neglected. So how much more objects that they have been requesting for? He just mentioned it casually. And then finally in 2010, before my just when I started my research, Professor Pejulayiwola posted the Benin1897.com Art and the Restitution Question, which led to a public advocacy for the return of the artworks stolen from Benin in 1897. I was then on the field and I carried out my research. And it was survey on impending returns. And in 2010, I utilized 3 forms of survey tools: 29, 2010, questionnaires, focus group discussion, key informant interviews, the cross-section of people in Benin City. It was a major research I conducted. University of Benin lecturers and students, I administered questionnaires, some staff and visitors to the museums, selected members of public, market women, politicians, daily paid workers. I administered a number of questionnaires, and also I conducted focus group discussion. Staff of the University of Benin, male, female, market women. I think I had 2 groups. Then I conducted 4 focus group discussions with 2 secondary school, total of 36 students from 2 secondary schools. I also interviewed key informants. A major chief in Benin, a prominent chief, a professor of history, one-time head of department of history, University of Benin. Also, he was a commissioner for culture and chieftaincy affairs in the mid-70s. I also interviewed the staff of the National Council for Arts and Culture here in Benin, social studies teachers, male, social, female, male, general overseer of a Pentecostal church, and a bronze caster. That was in 2010. And in 2021, few weeks ago, I carried out a pilot survey to sample the opinion of the people in anticipation for a larger population size to cover cross-section of people in Edo State. During this new research, I concentrated on my constituency, Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Since it was just a pilot survey, I just sent out 100 questionnaires, academic, non-academic staff, and our students through random sampling 100 to 400 level students, and 97 were returned. I asked 7 major research questions, the same 2010 and 2021. The first question: what's been new about Benin objects in museums abroad? In 2010, 53 respondents knew about 1897 British expedition. 40 had no idea how the objects got there. 7 were not too sure. In 2021, the level of awareness, 95% were sure they knew that, the objects were taken abroad. 5% didn't have vague ideas. But out of that 95%, 21% attributed to colonial masters, era of colonialism. It was taken away then. Another 4% said it was when the Europeans came for trade and they took the objects away. 5% said stolen artifacts. 32 were sure that 1897 British expedition, Benin massacre, and the remaining said, they were in the British museums, in museums abroad, tourism, for tourist attraction, and they were valued and seen as precious. Then they called for the objects to be returned. I asked whether they supported the move or not. In 2010, 78 respondents supported restitution of the objects, 20 preferred them to be retained in the foreign museums, and 2 said they had reasons to support, 2% had reasons to support both positions. In 2021, 82 wanted restitution, 18 did not. Why the positions they held? Those who said yes in 2010 said it's our cultural heritage. It's necessary for future reference to our past. It's also to teach our youths to know and preserve our culture, to enrich the museum and tourism industry, and it's not part of the culture of those holding them back, and also that they were acquired as war booties and considered illegal acquisition. In 2021, just a few weeks ago, those who said yes said they were part of our heritage. Legitimately Benin Nigerian objects, they were stolen objects and should be returned. And if returned, they can be renegotiated for loan. and temporary exhibitions for those who want to have them. And in 2010, I asked the question, why are you for restitution or why are you against? Those who were, those who were against it, they said the objects in 2010 projected the image of Benin Kingdom abroad, and for objects to act as Benin's contribution to the world community, and the need for the Nigerian government to concentrate on far more pressing issues, such as socio-economic welfare of the people, and also the idea that the objects were idols and fetish. That was in 2010. And those who said no, they didn't want restitution, 2021, they said they were more valued and appreciated and cared for out there, and that we have lived long enough without them, and also for the safety and objects of the objects back home may be a problem. For those who were undecided, I only got that in 2010, the prominent chief, the professor of history, and the staff of the National Council for Arts and Culture, according to them, they felt that we want the objects for sentimental, emotional reasons, and these objects were not willingly given away, but acquired as war booty. And the question should be, if the foreign museum directors and curators had the case reversed, they would not want to let go of these valuable objects, no matter how long. But on the other hand, they felt that the objects had done a good advertisement for Benin culture. It brought fame to the history and culture of the people, and it gained more recognition being out there. And if they are returned, their fate may be in jeopardy of those who won't properly care for them, and they may be stolen and back to the art market, as many people may not be ardent patrons of the national heritage. And once more, they said these objects are commonplace, many indigenous, they are still present, some shrine furniture, and readily reproduced by artists around. And they also mentioned that Benin traditional craftsmen are not valued as much. Now, when eventually returned, where is the best place for them to be kept? In 2010, 75% said the museum, 9% the palace, and 2% art gallery, 5% felt a new place should be created, and 9% no idea at all. In 2021, we had more in support for the palace, 23%, and 2% felt a new museum within the palace. 68% felt they should be returned to the museum. 4% felt a new museum specially designed for it, and 5% still insisted they should be left abroad. Why these specific places? And it was mentioned, my respondents mentioned that cultural objects are meant to be kept in museums. The museum is the safest place to them, so naturally should be in the museum. The museum is the best place, and it permits all categories of people to visit museums without any restriction. If it's in the palace, people may be afraid to go there. Now, also too, and that they felt museums were secure and safe, thieves may not break in there. And some respondents also felt it was better in the palace. The Oba is still revered by the people. In 2010, the chief advocated a new museum different from the Nigerian National Museum. The objects should be part of a new indigenous museum exclusive to Benin Edo people of Nigeria. In 2021, like I mentioned, the palace, people said because the palace is a place of Edo heritage and value, and the objects were initially removed from the palace, and it's a sacred place and a safe place, so it can be stored, kept there. They still mentioned museum as a safe place. It can be preserved and appreciated more. In 2021, my respondents still mentioned that the museum is a place free for any category of person. Also, they mentioned that a new museum, because a new museum, more attraction, and it should be a tourist center. And in general, I asked my respondent, have you ever visited the museums, when and what, why? Then in 2009-10, they said apart from school visits, just one person went there for research. Others, they took visitors there, and people didn't actually visit museums that much. But in 2021, 33% said as excursion school students, 14 for recreation, enlightenment, and research, 53 said no. And if so, how do you appreciate our cultural objects? Now, and this majority asking for a restitution of these objects. And they replied that the museum is not visited because it's seen as a foreign institution. And again, that people are familiar with all these objects, some of which are shrines in the city and decoration in people's houses. And that the idea of the museum did not catch on with the older generation. And so there is need for the older generation to indoctrinate the younger generation to appreciate the museum. As the chief then, that was in 2010, the chief advocated that there should be a serious effort to teach the younger generation the value of one's cultural heritage. He also mentioned that the economic situation of the country did not make people spend time in leisure, visit museums. According to him, hungry people don't visit museums. Furthermore, many people also came to identify the cultural objects as idols, idol worship, and not being able to differentiate traditional religion objects, calling them juju. This is what I didn't see in 2021. In 2021, I asked them, if you don't visit museums, where do you appreciate these objects? They said through books, magazines, calendar, internet, social media, and they can be seen in many open places. And some said they will visit the museum soon. In 2010, my conclusion was that from the respondents, especially the prominent chief, who noted that it may not be possible to acquire all the objects, but then we should get some back home. Restitution can also be in form of annual financial compensation to the Benin Traditional Council to aid reproduction of these objects. And there's also, yes, there is the need, he said, for reproducing these unknown objects. And the replacement may exist and can be viewed anywhere and in Benin. From the general survey conducted in 2010, majority of the respondents were in support of having some form of cultural objects back. A form of restitution was highly desired, and some form of restitution may renew the hope and interest in our arts and culture. A new indigenous museum was envisaged as far back then in 2010, and in regards financial, visual, and knowledge restitution was advocated. General conclusion from my 2021 research, there is a lot of awareness now, more awareness, I guess, through social media, and there is need for, I still insist that there is need for more awareness, education, and enlightenment for the general populace in Benin, Edo states, generally in Nigeria as a whole. From the research done so far, I still intend to go back to the field. Many respondents are in support of repatriation of the Benin objects in the museums worldwide, and there's hope that there will be renewed local interest in all these objects that drew fame to the Benin Kingdom. And the majority of the objects were carried away from the palace. The Oba of Benin is still revered by the people. A museum situated in the palace may just be ideal to suit this purpose. And a MOA is a welcome idea within the area of the palace ground. The new museum, traditionally, the palace has traditionally been the museum of the kingdom, pre-colonial, and it remains a valid precept in designing a new museum around the palace square within the area, and it will serve as a museum of the kingdom, museum of Edo State, museum of Nigeria, museum of West Africa, now in accordance with contemporary conception of archival library and museum methodology. The Oba of Benin, continues in his time-honored role as the patron of art is an ample justification for including a Benin Royal Museum within the palace ground. Now, the general populace must be carried along. There is need for the people to feel they are part of this heritage, no matter how long the objects have been away for. And there is also the need to connect with communities where traditional art are still being utilized to participate and be part of the new museum we are anticipating.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you for having me here in this conference. I want to apologize for not pre-recording because of the tight schedules I had, over the few days that this notice was given to me. I want to really talk generally on this issue of restitution and the position of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, because I will not talk at just my professional level, but because I'm the Director General and the Chief Executive, so I want to emphasize more the position of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. The National Commission for Museums and Monuments is actually the government agency that is saddled with the issue of handling artifacts in Nigeria, not only for display and storage, but also for educational purposes. What has happened over the years is that we had some form of underfunding. I think that's why the role of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments have not been fully, practiced, put into use. Now, our position currently regarding issues of repatriation is very clear. And I was actually in Edo, in Benin City. I met the governor of Edo State, and at different fora, I had explained the procedure and actually how the National Commission for Museums and Monuments is playing, in this issue currently, being reignited. Now, the issue of repatriation is very clear. We have the law establishing the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. Any issue of artifacts, antiquity in Nigeria is being handled by the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. That is why we are participating also in the Benin Dialogue. We are also reaching out to different museums, on this issue. And when it comes to illicit trafficking of antiquities, various, governments in Europe and US, the customs office actually contact us directly, and we provide the necessary information, and we claim ownership of any illicitly trafficked object. So we are very clear on this. Our participation for example, in the Benin Dialogue Group is to facilitate, the issue of repatriation of Benin objects, particularly because there is this growing interest, not only among the public, individuals and institutions, but also the public in the respective, countries where these objects are being kept presently. So there is this, zeal and enthusiasm for these museums that are holding our objects to return them back to their original, owners. And this has actually encouraged but also influenced the various museums to form different kind of groups and reaching out to us so that we'll be able to discuss the issue of repatriation. Now there are a lot of museums. There are museums and also individuals that actually contacted us on this issue of repatriation, on where these objects need to be returned. Is it to NCMM, that is the National Council, the Commission for Museums and Monuments, or is it to Edo State Government, or is it to the palace? These are issues for us actually to understand here and to sort out. There is no question that objects, artifacts are coming back to Nigeria. Where they're going to be in Nigeria is left to us to decide here, because we don't have any conflict either with the Edo State Government or with the palace, with the Benin Palace, on the issue of where these objects are going to be. But I want to reiterate that we do have, of course, the National Museum in Benin, where we have artifacts on Benin Bronzes on display and in storage. And we also have Benin objects across our museums in Nigeria. We have 52 museums, national museums in Nigeria, located in various states of the country. And they are called national museums because they have on display different artifacts across the country. On the issue of the repatriation of Benin Bronzes, we agree that artifacts that are coming, Benin Bronzes that are coming from museums outside the country, can be located in Benin. That's not an issue. And I totally support the issue of a new museum, especially the one that is proposed by the Edo State government, that's EMOA. And I totally support museums that specifically will display artifacts that are produced in Benin. Is an opportunity for our scholars, researchers, to be able to come to one place and be able to get the facts and the information that they want. And specialist museum now, for me, is the way forward, so that we can have museums specialize in a particular area or a particular kind of material and so on. And that is what is lacking here in Nigeria. And we will support this EMOA museum. But also, we need to understand that the National Commission for Museums and Monuments is the institution in Nigeria, the only institution in Nigeria legally allowed to receive any antiquity that is coming to Nigeria. This is very clear. When we take possession of any artifacts that is coming to Nigeria, then we can properly place it, for example, in the new Edo Museum, which we don't have issue. We want to support. We want our artifacts to come to Nigeria, and that is very clear. But the kind of impression that is being created, either outside the country or by some people who are not well informed, is that we are undecided as to who actually controls these antiquities, who is supposed to receive them, who is supposed, under whose care, and so on. I think this is created in order to divert the issues, the boiling issues, now coming off, on this aspect of repatriation. And I think that should not deter us. But also, as a professional myself, I am open to dialogue. Of course, it's very important, particularly when you have, such antiquities that are, away outside the country for so long, in the possession of different museums across the world. And suddenly now this issue of repatriation coming up, then of course is very, difficult for such museums to part with the these collections that they have for many years, and that has made their probably museums even famous because of these collections. So it is very difficult, but through dialogue and understanding, we'll be able to, come to an agreement. We do welcome agreement in a situation where, of course, these artifacts will come back to Nigeria, but at the same time, we can partner in a way that, these artifacts can also go back to these museums or these countries for exhibitions for a certain period and so on. I think we can work in that way. Anyway, museums are global, and collaboration is open and is very important, because it's just like research. You cannot foreclose your museum to your locality. So access to these objects will be available, of course, even if they are in Nigeria or outside Nigeria. But the most important thing is that we now recognize and we understand that these artifacts were taken away illegally outside the country. Now it is time for us to accept this and return these artifacts to their rightful owners, so that we take possession, and at the same time we'll be able to partner with the respective museums in a way that these objects can actually be at some point in time given to these museums on loan, so that they will be able to display these objects. They are produced, become a global, piece. And of course, we agree with that. But any artifact or any antiquity has a provenance. It is very important that we know that it has its own original, place where it came from. And it is very good, important for us to link our artifacts to this where they originally came from. Then there is also, I think, this understanding, which is triggered also by, the various, people and institutions in the respective countries, that, governments of those countries are also now at the forefront of willing to return our antiquities back to Nigeria, especially the recent pronouncement by the German government, and also the bold move by the University of Aberdeen Museum in the United Kingdom to return Benin bronze back to Nigeria, and these other pronouncements, and some of these museums, large museums, are not really comfortable with these pronouncements and arrangements, and I want to assure them that we are partnering with them. We are discussing with them. They should not be discouraged. They should understand our position, that we are willing to partner with them, even though they are not willing to part with some of these antiquities right away. But we can have an agreement, of course, where these objects can come in batches and so on. And also, make arrangements for traveling exhibitions, and we not only these objects that are, in the collections of museums outside the country that are, important, that are unique and so on. We have collections in our country here that are original and that are really unique, so we can share, in a traveling exhibition with these objects that some of these museums abroad don't have access or haven't had any access to them. We can be willing to jointly carry out exhibitions as well. So it is important for us to understand that there is no any ambiguity or any sort of misunderstanding as to how these objects will come, to Nigeria and where will they be and so on. This is not really an issue. And then the other aspect, of course, that is glaring, that is being, a subject of concern, is the issue of security and where these artifacts will be displayed. Of course, we do have our problems in terms of, the state of our museums in the country, but that will not remain as it is forever. We have our plans to, build more museums, and that's why the MOR Museum is a bold step. And that MOR Museum is going to be partly funded by institutions abroad, and also NCMM is a partner. The Edo State government is a partner. The Oba's Palace is also a partner. So we all partner to come up with this new museum. And this new museum is going to be at an archaeological site, and which is under the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. So we do support having modern, well secured museums to house these collections that are coming. And also we need to also understand that we are going to have a new museum in Abuja as well, because the National Museum in Abuja is on the drawing board, but we are going to come up with a new museum, which is also going to be a place where we can have representative, collections of our objects from different parts of the country, so that our national issues about national unity is presented in this new museum. And of course, we are going to upgrade our existing museums. The National Museum Benin will be upgraded, to have modern facilities and storage facilities that will accommodate any spill out of the artifacts that may occur in this new MOR museum that will be built. And we are proposing, of course, I discussed with the Edo State Governor, that the new museum, which is very close to the palace, the Oba's Palace, and the National Museum is also not far from the palace, that we're going to have a cultural hub, a tourist, attraction, zone, where these museums will be linked together, and the Oba's Palace will be linked together, so that we'll make it a cultural hub where families, researchers, and so can actually comfortably visit all these places and have interaction with our collections as well. So we yes, thank you very much. So in essence, we also have our existing museums in Lagos, in Ibadan, in Enugu, and Jos. All these are large museums. They have large galleries, So we are going to upgrade those ones, and so that we'll have display of these collections that may come as well. But also, I think what I want finally to urge our partners and institutions abroad is to contribute towards upgrading and construction of our new museums. Think of it, these objects have been in the possessions of these museums for all these years, and we have not attracted any compensation or anything, and these objects have made these museums also famous. So I think it is the right time that our partners also contribute. Thank you very much. This my presentation. I await any comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tijani. So unfortunately, we are not going to have Okunre, so it's going to be the two of you and myself for this conversation following your wonderful presentations. But I would like to give you a chance to respond in a way or to take into account something that has been said by Okunre precisely. It seemed to me very interesting that she had figures to put behind the notion of popular expectation. What actually is the expectation of the people of civil society beyond the circle of academics and scholars and professionals of museum? Because this, it seems to me that these polling and comparison between the polling in 2010 and 2021 is very interesting because she has these proportions and so on and so forth. So to put the conversation in a certain framing, there was this notion of a trauma narrative, as I would call it. The idea that because 1897 was this massacre and the plunder, same thing that happened in Dahomey, which is now Benin, the state of Benin, with the plunder in 1892, and France having taken away the regalia of the last king of Abomey, Béhanzin. So these are historical events connected very precisely to the plundering from precise locations of these objects that are identifiable as having been looted. So the narrative would be that there was this trauma and there was a continuous memory of these objects missing. But now, the figures we are given do not go exactly in that direction. And to just put the question this way, when we had in October the meeting at this very location of the Italian Academy, Professor Pole from Benin, who has been, who is a professor in philosophy, but who has been also a minister, just bluntly posed this following question. Okay, we are discussing restitution, but are African populations asking for any kind of restitution? So this was a very provocative way of posing the question. And I would like you to react to the way in which that question is documented and presented in a way in Okunre's paper. So Felicity, can I ask you? And this is actually one of the questions also posed in the chat.
Thank you very much for your question. I think it's quite hard for me to react to Okunre's work. I know the work she did in 2010, and I did find it interesting, in particular, what she mentioned, that there is a greater consciousness of 1897 and of the existence of the collections outside of Benin City. It's something I feel that really gathered momentum in the last 5 years. And when I went back to Benin, and the last time, I was struck by an initiative to have an exhibition be held where photos of the objects in situ in the museums where they were around the world would be shown during the Igwe Festival. And I think it was in 2018. And I remember that in the years that I had, in 2 years earlier, when I had been there before, I had tried to also explain where the pieces are and how many pieces are in different museums. I think there's always been a keen awareness that they are abroad and that they are at the British Museum, for example. What people didn't seem to be aware of was the level of their dispersal and also their presence, for example, in Germany or in the United States or globally, actually. And I think this is something that has that social media also has contributed to changing. There has just been a lot more information circulating on where the objects are. And this exhibition, which was held in 2018, really had a strong impact on the Benin population, because for the first time, and I mean, it was really at the heart of the Igwe installations. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to the exhibition, but I really have the feeling that it was kind of a aha moment for a lot of people in Benin City. As to the awareness of people in Benin City, I think it's always been very strong since what I've been able to see and been able to document. It's been very strong since the 1930s at least. I don't have much sources for the period before that, but I think it grew, and it grew in particular in the 50s and in the 60s in relation to this strange campaign to buy the pieces back, or to get them back by asking nicely, which happened at that time. But I would love to hear from our colleague at the NCMM how he feels about this change in awareness in the last few years.
Yes, just before you respond, Professor Tijani, let me add to that in her presentation, Okunde mentioned also the interest in the countries where these objects were kept. And you came back to that when you mentioned Aberdeen, for example. It is interesting to see that civil societies in the Western countries themselves, because this new awareness about social justice, etc., might be pressuring their own museums for the return of these objects. So please, Professor Tijani.
Thank you very much. I think we need to understand that, the question of this interest of the public arose because of awareness. Before, we read all these things, from the books, because when I was in secondary school, in the history books, I read about the Benin, punitive expeditions and so on. And that was only to the level of those who actually did history or art history and so on. But even that it means that even at the level of those who have gone to school is only for those who have done these subjects at that level. The First Act 1977 that also brought some awareness, especially with regards to the Queen Ada, mask that was requested, but was refused. The awareness was not much because at that time, there was no much publicity. So today, as a result of, one, the expansion of museums, for example, in Nigeria, we have 52 museums now across the country, and almost in every museum, you will find a Benin bronze on display. So that has also created this awareness, where if you go through a guided tour, when we were talking about Benin, bronzes, this issue of this punitive expedition is also mentioned. So that has created this awareness, and also of recent, this zeal about this, this black, thing matters and all these sort of things, and actually brought about this, zeal and enthusiasm for people now to start asking this question: why, antiquities that are originally, stolen from their, countries are still lying in museums in Europe. So there's a need, for these artifacts to return to their, original owners. So I think the social media has also expanded, has, contributed towards this awareness. But also, people in Europe that go to see these artifacts have now realized, particularly the people in those countries have realized the need for these artifacts to go back to their original owners. I think this has also contributed towards this discussion of issue of repatriation. I think it's going on and on and on, and that's why many of these individual collectors and small museums are willing to give back these artifacts before it becomes really a big issue.
Precisely, one very question having to do is giving back. Christine Kramer at the National Museum of African Art mentioned in her presentation in the first session that her museum had contacted the authorities in Nigeria in 2017 about a Benin bronze object that came into their collection, but they discovered that this object had been previously in the National Museum in Benin. And she asked if you could look into this matter and respond to the Smithsonian about the possibility of returning this object. You might not have an answer right now, but this is one of the questions that appeared in the chat. Now, in connection with the new museum, because in terms of location, you mentioned the possibility of having these objects returned to the palace, or more probably to this new museum. And there was a question about the relationship between the new museum and archaeological research being done right now. Anything you can say about the connection between ongoing archaeological research and the new museum? I think it is part of the conversation with the German government, isn't it?
Yes, I mean it's the concept of this MOA museum, is that the museum is going to present, about Benin, about Edo. So that is why the idea of citing the museum itself in an archaeological site will be an added value to the museum, being that whatever archaeological excavation, whatever discoveries are made at the site will form part of the museum itself. And possibly the objects in situ, where they are being excavated, are displayed in a way that will be part of the objects that are on display in the museum. So that is the concept. That's the whole idea of building the museum or constructing the museum at the archaeological site, so that it becomes part of not just a museum but also part of an archaeological site. So it will attract more interest and more visitors as well. That was the idea, and with the MCMM being the institution responsible for any archaeological site, we are partnering with them so that this museum is sited there. And it's an interesting one. The design, the concept I think is convincing, and we do support it very much as well. The other one you mentioned about the object in the Smithsonian, Kramer actually contacted me as well. We are going to discuss that issue. She also mentioned about the object being Ife, not Benin. There's one object that, but there is this influence of Ife on Benin art, which many of us don't know. We sometimes mistakenly assume that a Benin, artifact is not Benin, is Ife, because of the influence of Benin, of Ife on Benin art. So it's very difficult. One has to be very careful and, in trying to draw conclusions as well. But I want to emphasize that some of these objects that are in museums in Europe or in other parts of the world are actually part of illicit trafficking, not part of the Benin punitive expedition. Some of these objects were actually on display in our museums that were stolen and found themselves in museums outside the country. We have discovered a few of them, and we have requested for return of them, and some have been returned. So we are following up on that as well.
Okay. Two other points of discussion, and to both of you, you have insisted very much on your openness to dialogue and the will to have partnerships. So there is this insistence that restitution is not just a zero sum game where you are taking back something that was taken from, but these objects, in a way, are going to create the type of partnership in a global rethinking of museums and relationship between museums also. And it reminds me that the very subtitle of the report written by Kelvin Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy was vers une nouvelle éthique relationnelle, towards a new ethical relation, for example. So, and the word ethics was very strong word. So I would like to ask you, Felicity, how you give content to that, the partnership that these objects being returned first and foremost, because they were taken illegally, would positively, so to say, create new bonds and new relations between museums.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it will be key, and I think it's something we've already seen in situations where restitutions have occurred with other museums in relation to other parts of the world, creating new narratives, creating new collaborations. For many museums, actually restitution, giving something back, has been a lease of new life. That's something that some European museums have actually experienced. And I think that is also why smaller institutions perhaps are moving on this more quickly, because there is a real interest for them to build these collaborations, to have these new relationships with countries of origin like Nigeria. I also think, and I also believe it's actually only the beginning of something. Actually, this moment when an object is returned is the beginning of a whole new story, and also for the museum that returns something. And I would really insist on that. Every time I've spoken to museum professionals who have been involved in restitution processes, they have always underlined how fruitful it was for them and for their institutions. So I do believe very much in this relational aspect of restitution, in the fact that it's very hard right now for museums in Nigeria to feel like they can have symmetrical relationships with museums who not only have not restituted but have lent very little to Nigerian institutions. Even the circulation of objects, without even going as far as speaking of restitutions, has been very limited. And I think this is something that means that you can't really have an equal dialogue between professionals until there's until we're all behaving in the same way in all directions. So yeah, I think it's absolutely key. This notion of changing the nature of our relations is in fact the real for me the real enjeu. I can't think of the English word.
But precisely given the fact that you are someone who worked on Benin digital Benin, I'd like to ask you, prolonging your response, what role would digitization play in this collaboration as a complement, maybe, to restitution? Do you see it?
Yeah, I think it's a complement. It's also a form of what I think Kokunri also mentioned, and I think Dan Hicks also mentioned. I'm not sure whether he mentioned it in this talk, but there's also the necessity to restitute the knowledge that's been lost, and also to not just to restitute the knowledge that's been lost, but to also acknowledge that there are things that have been lost that we may not be able to bring back together again. So it's not about the aim of Digital Benin is to allow us to again have an idea of what the Royal Court Treasure was in 1897, to give a relatively complete picture, but also to show the level of information of provenance that we have, but also the things that are missing, the things that we still need to uncover, the amazing research that still needs to be done to understand these pieces and to be able to recreate the context around court life in Benin City in 1897, thanks to them. I think it's really a pity that Professor Agbontin Egafona isn't here. She's done some amazing work that we're going to also try and integrate into Digital Benin on the places of conservation in Benin City and the way the objects were preserved through time, so that we really understand what this collection meant for the court. So there's also, of course, the desire to restitute a form of information, knowledge, and emotion, an emotion that you get from seeing all of these pieces come together in one, even if it's a virtual space, in one space. For me, it's been quite moving actually to see that happen. And I think that part of that will be restituted, at least partially, through the visual media, which should help accompany AMOA in its development, and also be a source for those who can't physically go to the museum, even in Nigeria or in Europe. Not everybody lives close to the museum, not everybody has the means to go there. So I think it's just really to make the accessibility as open as possible, but we don't see ourselves in any way as being a substitute for restitution or an alternative. It's really it's something that should accompany it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It turns out that this was the last question, and so I'm very happy that we ended on that very positive note about tcollaboration, partnership, concepts that have been also very much repeated by Professor Abba Tijani. So it has been a pleasure, really, and an honor to be moderating this wonderful panel, and I'm very happy to return now the floor to my good friend David, maybe, for concluding remarks.
I think Pierre was due to go, and then I will say goodbye to everybody with one extra reflection, but which I would like to have a chance to say at the end. But Pierre, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, I just want to thank again all the great panelists who have accepted our invitation today. As they used to say on live television, these are the issues that come from live television. So we just experienced some of those. And I apologize to all the people who were watching us today. And I also wanted to say that we will forward the questions that could not be answered to the people they were meant for. So hopefully there are some more answers that will come from direct exchanges between our attendees and the panelists. Again, thank you so much. I think we have heard a lot to reflect on and could continue our thought process about the question of returns and restitution. Thank you very much.
So let me add to Pierre's thanks to everybody. I also want to thank Pierre himself for, as I said, having been the original fons et origo of this talk. I want to thank all our participants, Barbara Blankensteiner, Christine Malin-Creamer, Philippe Hernandez, Dan Hicks, Felicity Podenstein, Korkunre Agafona, and Abaiza Tijani. Thank you so much for making this most stimulating discussion on this most crucial of issues of our time, one of the most crucial cultural issues of our time. I look forward to seeing you all at a future event at the Italian Academy, live and embodied and ready to drink together and to battle together. Talking of battle, however, I want to raise one issue. It turned out that I was excluded from the possibility of commenting on the wonderful discussions we've had today. And the only reason I wanted to say something was this has been a great event, but in a way it turned out to be an uncontroversial event. I like some fight in these discussions, but we were all agreed. It is indisputably the case that the Benin Bronzes, as we continue to call them, should go back. We can all discuss whether all should go back or some should go back. But I would like to raise one question. It occurred to me as we were doing this. If we send all this back, if we say to all the objects, go home now, back to Africa, does this not send a chill down our spine? What are we going to lose? I am sitting way out of civilization here in a dark corner of Maine, sitting out the crisis. And I can tell you that every fisherman I know here would benefit from seeing one Benin bronze, from being made to understand what it means, why it is of the same status as the masterpieces of the few works of art they know already. So in a way, I think we do have to think about what this loss might mean for us. You might say, well, digital reproductions can provide the same information, the same knowledge, and the same emotion. I'm not so sure. The objects must go back, I think we can all agree. But let us reflect, seeing that Dan Hicks himself raised the question of the relationship between race and culture and the kinds of damage which predation, predatory behavior, punitive expeditions have done. But we must ask ourselves also, what is lost? This is not a plea for the Universal Museum back again. This is a plea for us to remain open as these objects go back to cultural understanding that is ecumenical, irenic, and capable of healing the wounds that we have made in the past. Thank you all so much for being present. Thank you all the organizers. Thank you, the organizers, I mean my dear colleagues at the Italian Academy. The follow-up at the International Observatory for Cultural Heritage will take place soon and hopefully when the plague is over. Thank you all. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night.